The frontier town of Redemption Creek holds many secrets beneath its dusty streets and weathered storefronts, but none greater than the truth behind Martha Blackwell, the elderly widow who runs the modest general store at the edge of town. 2. Locals, she's just a kindly old woman with arthritic hands and fading eyesight, struggling to maintain her late husband's business. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. What no one suspects is that 30 years ago, Martha rode under a different name, Black Rose Madison, the ruthless and brilliant leader of the notorious Madison Raiders, the most feared outlaw gang west of the Mississippi. For a decade, her name struck terror into the hearts of bankers, railroad magnates, and lawmen alike. Her tactical genius and uncompromising leadership built an empire through perfectly executed heists that left no witnesses and no trail. Now, as a new gang of brutal opportunists arrives in Redemption Creek, Martha's carefully constructed, peaceful existence faces its greatest test. These men see only a vulnerable old woman, easy prey for their extortion and intimidation. They couldn't be more wrong. As their threats escalate, the embers of Martha's former self begin to glow beneath decades of careful deception. The Black Rose never truly died. She merely went dormant. And these foolish men are about to discover why, even in her prime, the most dangerous thing about Martha Madison was always underestimating her. The morning sun climbed reluctantly over the eastern ridge, painting Redemption Creek in hues of amber and gold. Dust motes danced in the slanting light that filtered through the windows of Blackwell's general store, catching on the meticulously arranged merchandise, canned goods, dry goods, tools, and sundries that served the modest needs of the town's 300 residents. Martha Blackwell moved slowly among the shelves, her gnarled fingers straightening items with practiced precision. At 72, her once tall frame had begun to stoop, and silver hair pulled back in a severe bun accentuated the deep lines etched into her face by decades of western sun and wind. A pair of wire-rimmed spectacles perched on her nose, occasionally sliding down when she bent to arrange items on lower shelves. "Morning, Mrs. Blackwell," called young Timothy Fletcher as he burst through the door, bell jingling cheerfully above. "Ma says we need sugar and coffee, and Pa needs more shotgun shells if you've got 'em." Martha turned with the careful deliberation of age, a gentle smile softening her weathered features. "Good morning, Timothy. The coffee just came in on yesterday's stage, premium from New Orleans." Her voice carried the slight rasp of age, but beneath it lay a clarity and precision that seemed at odds with her frail appearance. As she gathered the requested items, her movements maintained a peculiar duality, slow and methodical as befit a woman of her years, yet marked by an economy of motion that wasted no energy. A careful observer might have noted how her eyes, despite their apparent weakness in the way she squinted at labels, missed nothing about her surroundings. They might have wondered why the seemingly random arrangement of merchandise provided clear sight lines to every entrance and window, or how the heavy oak counter was positioned to create a natural barrier between her and potential threats. But no one in Redemption Creek was that observant. To them, Martha was simply the widow who had appeared 15 years ago following her husband's death, purchasing the struggling general store with surprising cash reserves she attributed to prudent savings. In a frontier town where most folks arrived carrying their pasts in unmarked graves, few questions were asked about the quiet widow who kept to herself while providing essential services. "That'll be 75 cents, Timothy," Martha said, wrapping the purchases in brown paper with hands that sometimes trembled with apparent arthritis. If the boy had been paying attention, he might have noticed that the tremor disappeared entirely when she counted his coins with quick precision. "Thanks, Mrs. Blackwell. Pa says to tell you he'll be by later with that repair to your back door lock," he promised. Martha nodded appreciatively. "Tell him I'm grateful. These old doors don't keep out the drafts like they used to." What young Timothy couldn't know was that Martha had intentionally damaged the lock herself, creating an opportunity to have someone else install the special mechanism she had secretly modified. The new lock would appear ordinary while containing a silent alarm system of her own design, one of many such innovations hidden throughout her seemingly simple store. As the boy departed, Martha moved to the window, adjusting a display of canned peaches that afforded her a clear view of Redemption Creek's main street. 15 years she had lived this careful facade, crafting the identity of Martha Blackwell with the same meticulous attention she had once given to planning the Madison Raiders' most audacious heists. 15 years of binding her still strong hands in bandages to simulate arthritis, of stooping her shoulders and slowing her step, of pretending to fail eyesight while missing nothing. The town was stirring to life as the sun climbed higher. Sheriff Wilson made his morning rounds, tipping his hat to Martha when he noticed her in the window. The blacksmith's hammer created a familiar rhythm, punctuating the morning's quiet. At the far end of the street, the Golden Nugget Saloon stood silent after its raucous night, though Martha knew from the fresh hoofprints that someone had departed the establishment just before dawn. Her gaze lingered on those tracks, new prints, from horses not common to Redemption Creek stables. The depth and pattern suggested heavy riders, well armed. Martha had memorized the distinctive prints of every horse that regularly traveled these streets, just as she had catalogued the gait and habits of every resident. These were strangers, and in her experience, strangers meant either opportunity or threat. At her age, she had long since abandoned interest in opportunities. The bell above the door jingled again, announcing the arrival of Margaret Sullivan, the banker's wife, whose Tuesday visits for tea and gossip had become a ritual Martha tolerated. For the valuable information they provided. "Martha, my dear, have you heard?" Margaret began without preamble, her voice pitched low with the delicious tension of someone bearing significant news. "Riders came in last night, took rooms at the Golden Nugget. Anderson says they're not the usual drummer or cattle buyer type, hard men with the look of the border about them." Martha arranged her features into an expression of mild concern as she prepared tea on the small stove behind the counter. "I'm sure Sheriff Wilson will keep an eye on things," she offered, carefully measuring loose tea leaves with fingers she deliberately allowed to tremble slightly. "That's just it," Margaret continued, leaning forward conspiratorially. "Bill Winters at the telegraph office says there was a wire about a week ago to the sheriff from up Tucson way, warning about a gang moving south after some trouble there. Robberies, roughing up storekeepers, really mean business." Martha's mind processed this information with lightning efficiency behind her mask of grandmotherly concern. The timing aligned with reports she'd read in week-old newspapers from up north. The Durant gang, named for their leader, Frank Durant, had been cutting a swathe through small towns across Arizona territory, employing tactics that were brutal but effective. Not particularly sophisticated operators compared to others. She had known and led, but dangerous in their unpredictability and willingness to employ excessive violence. "My goodness," Martha murmured, her voice carefully modulated to project elderly worry. "Do you think they would cause trouble here in Redemption Creek? We're such a small town." Margaret warmed to her role as herald of potential disaster. "That's exactly what makes us a target, dear. Small enough that resistance would be minimal, large enough to be worth their while. Anderson says they've been asking questions about the town's businesses. Who owns what? Who might have cash on hand?" As Margaret continued her recitation of town gossip, Martha's mind worked on multiple levels. On the surface, she participated in the conversation with appropriate concern and interest. Beneath that, she was already assessing threats, cataloging resources, and formulating contingencies with the strategic acumen that had once made her the most successful outlaw leader in 3 territories. When Margaret finally departed an hour later, Martha locked the front door and turned the sign to closed for lunch. Instead of eating, however, she moved with surprising agility to the back room of her store, where a hidden trap door beneath a heavy rug led to a basement unknown to the town's residents. The space below was small, but meticulously organized. 1. Wall-held weapons. Not just the ordinary rifles and shotguns a frontier shopkeeper might reasonably possess, but specialized firearms maintained in perfect condition despite their age. Another area contained documents, newspaper clippings, territorial maps marked with notations, and information about Redemption Creek's residents and businesses, all meticulously catalogued and updated. Martha moved to a dusty trunk in the corner, unlocking it with a key she wore beneath her high-necked dress. Inside lay artifacts from another life, a black leather riding outfit that had been the signature of the Black Rose, custom-made revolvers with rose emblems inlaid in the grips, and a journal filled with precise handwriting documenting the Madison Raiders' most successful operations. Her fingers, free from their affected tremor, traced the embossed rose on the journal's cover. 30 years since she had been that woman. 30 years since circumstances forced her to craft a masterful disappearance, allowing the notorious Black Rose to fade into frontier legend, while Martha Madison began the careful process of building new identities, eventually settling on Martha Blackwell after several transitions. The Madison Raiders had been unlike other outlaw gangs. Under Martha's leadership, they operated more like a military unit than common bandits, while male-led gangs relied on brute force and intimidation. Martha had built her reputation on immaculate planning, psychological warfare, and the strategic application of precisely measured violence. The Black Rose never killed indiscriminately, but those who crossed her never lived to regret it. The Durant gang was nothing like her former operation. Crude, excessively violent, and lacking the sophisticated planning that had been her hallmark, but they were dangerous precisely because of their unpredictability and willingness to employ brutality where subtlety would serve better. Martha carefully replaced the items in the trunk, locking away the physical remnants of her past. The strategic mind that had orchestrated the most elaborate heists across the Western Territories, however, was already calculating, assessing, preparing. She returned to the store level and methodically checked the various defensive preparations she had unobtrusively integrated into the building over the years, the reinforced panels behind seemingly ordinary shelves that could stop bullets, the hidden compartments containing weapons accessible from key positions, the modified floorboards that would create strategic noise to alert her to an intruder's position. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Martha had chosen Redemption Creek with the same careful consideration she had once given to selecting banks to rob. Small enough to avoid attention, positioned at a crossroads that allowed her to monitor regional developments, with a population unlikely to ask too many questions about a widow's past. For 15 years, it had served its purpose perfectly, providing her a quiet retirement after decades of careful maneuvering to ensure her legendary alter ego remained safely buried in history. Now, potential trouble has arrived. Martha considered her options as she reopened the store for afternoon business. At 72, she was not the physical force she had been in her prime, though she maintained a regimen of private exercises that kept her far stronger than her frail appearance suggested. Her mind, however, remained her greatest weapon, the strategic brilliance that had allowed the Madison Raiders to operate for a decade without a single member being captured. The afternoon brought a steady stream of customers, many clearly using their purchases as pretexts to share or gather information about the strangers in town. Martha played her role perfectly, expressing measured concern while subtly extracting useful intelligence from each interaction. By closing time, she had compiled a comprehensive assessment of the Durant gang's composition and activities. 6 men total. Frank Durant, the leader, a former Confederate officer turned outlaw after the war. His right hand, Cummings, a brutal enforcer with a reputation for unnecessary cruelty. 4 others of varying backgrounds but similar inclinations toward violence. They had spent the day observing the town's routines, paying particular attention to the bank, the stagecoach office, and the larger businesses. According to Wilma Jenkins from the hotel, they had specifically asked about the old woman's store at the edge of town, whether Martha lived alone, how she managed the business, and if she kept significant cash on hand. The questions confirmed Martha's suspicion that they saw her as a soft target, perhaps their first move in establishing control over Redemption Creek's commerce. As Martha locked the front door and extinguished the main lamps, she moved through, her closing routine with the automatic precision of long habit. To any observer, she appeared to be simply an elderly shopkeeper, securing her business for the night. In reality, she was preparing for what she anticipated would be the Durant gang's first overture. She did not have long to wait. Just as she had finished her modest dinner in the small apartment above the store, the distinctive sound of multiple horses approaching from the direction of town reached her ears. Martha quickly adjusted her clothing to enhance her appearance of frailty, mussed her hair slightly to suggest she had been preparing for bed, and selected a heavy wooden cane she normally used only during particularly damp weather when her performance required visible evidence of joint pain. The riders stopped outside her store. Through the slightly parted curtains, Martha counted 5 horses, nearly the entire Durant gang. The message was clear: intimidation through numbers. She allowed herself a small, grim smile before arranging her features into an expression of elderly concern. Heavy boots sounded on her porch steps, followed by a pounding at the door that would have startled or frightened a genuine elderly widow. "Who's there?" Martha called, allowing her voice to waver with apparent fear. "The store's closed till morning." "Got a delivery, Mrs. Blackwell," came the response, the voice carrying a false joviality that didn't mask its underlying menace. "Special order all the way from Tucson." Martha shuffled to the door, making a show of struggling with the locks before opening it just enough to peer out cautiously, the chain still engaged. The man standing on her porch wore the dust of the trail and the confident smirk of someone accustomed to inspiring fear. Behind him, 4 others lounged against the porch railing, hands near weapons, postures deliberately intimidating. "Frank Durant, ma'am." The leader introduced himself with a mock tip of his hat. "My associates and I are new to your fine community. Thought we'd introduce ourselves to the local business owners." Martha peered at him through her spectacles, projecting confusion and timidity. "It's very late for business calls, Mr. Durant. Perhaps you could return during store hours tomorrow." Durant's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Now, that wouldn't be neighborly of me, Mrs. Blackwell. I understand. You're all alone here, running this big store without any help. That must be difficult for a woman of your advanced years." "I manage well enough," Martha replied, her voice deliberately quavering. "Sheriff Wilson checks on me regularly." Durant chuckled, the sound devoid of humor. "Sheriffs might be busy. Tonight, some commotion over at the saloon got his attention. Might be a while before he makes his rounds this way." The implied threat hung in the air between them. Martha recognized the tactic: isolate the target, establish control through fear, then present the proposition that would begin their systematic extraction of resources. It was crude compared to the psychological operations she had once orchestrated, but effective against those unable to recognize the pattern. "What do you want, Mr. Durant?" she asked, allowing a note of resignation to enter her voice. "Just to offer our services, ma'am." "Way I hear it, Redemption Creek's been having trouble with drifters and thieves lately. Wouldn't want anything to happen to a defenseless widow lady's business. For a modest weekly consideration, say $20, my boys and I could ensure your protection." Behind her spectacles, Martha's eyes catalogued every detail of the men on her porch, their positioning, the weapons they carried, the way they distributed their weight. Professional habits die hard, and the former leader of the Madison Raiders had spent decades reading men's capabilities and weaknesses from such details. What she saw confirmed her initial assessment. The Durant gang was dangerous but undisciplined. Their leader possessed crude cunning but lacked the strategic depth that had made the Black Rose legendary. These were opportunistic predators, not calculated strategists. Martha's mind still razor-sharp. Behind her elderly facade, had already formulated multiple approaches to handling the situation. The simplest would be to pay their protection fee temporarily while preparing a more permanent solution. That approach would maintain her cover as a vulnerable old woman while buying time. Alternatively, she could summon help from the sheriff, though that would likely only delay the inevitable confrontation while potentially exposing her to greater scrutiny than she preferred. Third option, eliminating the threat directly, was within her capabilities even now, but would risk exposing abilities inconsistent with Martha Blackwell's carefully crafted persona. Decision made, Martha sighed heavily, projecting defeat and fear. "I don't have that kind of money on hand, Mr. Durant. Business hasn't been that good. Perhaps $5 a week? That's all I can spare." Durant's expression hardened. "20's the going rate, Mrs. Blackwell. Though I suppose we could accept 10 as a first week's good faith payment. We wouldn't want to burden you unnecessarily." His tone suggested exactly the opposite. Martha made a show of reluctance before unlatching the door and admitting Durant, leaving his men outside as she shuffled to the counter where the day's earnings were kept. As she moved, her keen peripheral vision noted every detail of Durant's posture, the way his eyes assessed the store's contents, cataloging valuables and positions with the practiced eye of a predator. What he failed to notice was how Martha positioned herself with the counter between them, her hand never far from a hidden compartment containing a loaded derringer. He didn't observe how her stooped posture, while projecting frailty, kept her center of gravity balanced for rapid movement if needed. Most importantly, he missed entirely the calculating assessment in her eyes, momentarily visible when he turned to examine a shelf of premium liquor. "This all seems very fine for such a small town," Durant remarked, running a finger along a bottle of imported whiskey. "My late husband had particular tastes," Martha replied, counting out coins with deliberate slowness. "I keep a few quality items for the railroad executives who pass through." The explanation was plausible, hiding the truth that Martha maintained certain luxuries from long habits, accustomed to them from her days when the Black Rose had enjoyed the spoils of her successful enterprises. As she handed over the money, Durant's fingers closed around her wrist, applying just enough pressure to communicate the threat without leaving marks. "We'll be back next week, Mrs. Blackwell. I trust you'll have the full amount then. Terrible things happen to businesses that can't afford proper protection." Martha allowed her hand to tremble in his grip, her eyes widening with apparent fear. "Yes, Mr. Durant, I'll have it." Satisfied with the effect of his intimidation, Durant released her and moved toward the door. "Pleasure doing business with you, ma'am. Sleep well." Only after the sound of hoofbeats faded into the distance did Martha allow her posture to straighten, the tremor to leave her hands, and the sharp, calculating expression that had once made hardened outlaws follow her without question to return to her eyes. "Poor choice of targets, Mr. Durant," she murmured to the empty store. "You should have done better research." Martha moved to the window, watching the distant riders disappear into the darkness. To any observer, she appeared to be nothing more than a frightened old woman watching her tormentors depart. In reality, she was already calculating timing, resources, and strategic approaches with the same methodical precision that had once made the Black Rose the most feared outlaw leader. In the Western Territories, the Durant gang had gravely miscalculated. They believed they had found an easy victim, a frail widow running a modest business alone. Instead, they had unwittingly challenged a legend who had orchestrated the most elaborate and successful robberies across 3 territories, who had outfoxed Pinkertons and military possessions alike, and who had created and commanded the most disciplined outlaw organization the West had ever known. The Black Rose had been dormant for 30 years. But as Martha turned from the window, the set of her shoulders and the cold calculation in her eyes suggested that perhaps some legends never truly die. They merely wait for the right moment to bloom once more. Dawn broke over Redemption Creek with a violent crimson glow that local superstition held as an ill omen. Martha Blackwell observed it from her second-floor window, noting how the blood-red light illuminated the town's weathered buildings. 30 years ago, she might have considered such a dawn auspicious, the color of the Black Rose's signature bandana that had struck fear into the hearts of lawmen across 3 territories. Now it simply confirmed her assessment of trouble brewing. The Durant gang's visit last night was merely their opening gambit. Experience told her they would be making similar offers to other vulnerable businesses in town, establishing their dominance through a pattern of escalating intimidation. Martha, dressed with care, selecting clothing that enhanced her appearance of frailty, a high-necked dress slightly too large for her frame, creating the illusion of a woman shrinking with age. She wrapped her still strong hands in light bandages, a prop she employed to explain her occasional difficulty with fine motor tasks while concealing the calluses inconsistent with a shopkeeper's life. As she descended to the store, her mind was occupied with practical matters. The Durant gang's presence necessitated certain preparations, but these needed to be executed without betraying capabilities beyond those expected of Martha Blackwell. A delicate balance, but one she had maintained for 15 years through careful habit. The morning brought customers eager to share news and rumors. Tobias Jenkins from the feed store confirmed Martha's prediction. "They visited half the businesses on Main Street last night," he reported in hushed tones, leaning across her counter. "Same story everywhere. Protection money. Miller at the hardware store tried to refuse. This morning his front window was smashed and his best tools stolen." Martha clucked sympathetically while mentally cataloguing this information. The pattern was familiar. Established dominance through targeted violence against those who resist, creating examples that would compel compliance from others. "What about Sheriff Wilson?" she asked, adjusting her spectacles with deliberately unsteady fingers. Jenkins shook his head. "Caught a bullet in the leg when he tried to intervene at Miller's. Nothing serious, but he's laid up at Doc Sullivan's. His deputy's green as spring grass. Looks terrified to death whenever Durant's men walk past the jail." Strategic incapacitation of law enforcement, predictable but effective. Martha's estimation of Durant rose marginally. He might lack sophistication, but he understood the fundamentals of establishing territorial control. "Such terrible times," Martha murmured, her voice projecting elderly concern while her mind rapidly assessed community resources and potential allies. "I suppose we'll all just have to pay until proper help arrives." Jenkins nodded glumly. "Telegraph sent word to the marshal's office in Tucson, but it could be weeks before they respond. Small towns like ours aren't exactly a priority." After Jenkins departed, Martha continued her normal routine with the practiced ease of someone who had perfected a role through years of performance. She served customers, ordered supplies, and maintained the meticulous organization of her inventory. To anyone watching, she appeared to be nothing more than an elderly shopkeeper concerned about recent events, but carrying on with dignity. Shortly before noon, The bell above her door announced a visitor who moved with the confident swagger of someone unaccustomed to being refused entry anywhere. Martha recognized Frank Durant immediately, though he now wore a clean shirt and polished boots, presenting himself as a businessman rather than the brigand who had threatened her the previous night. "Mrs. Blackwell," he greeted her with exaggerated courtesy, removing his hat with a flourish. "I trust you slept well." Martha allowed her hands to tremble slightly as she arranged items on the counter. "As well as could be expected, Mr. Durant." Durant smiled, the expression failing to reach his eyes. "I've been making acquaintances around your charming town. Interesting community you have here." "We're simple folk," Martha replied, her posture subtly emphasizing her apparent frailty. "Not much excitement in Redemption Creek. That's about to change." Durant moved through her store with the predatory assessment of someone evaluating future property. "I've decided to establish more permanent business interests here. Your town has potential." Martha watched him through lowered lashes, noting how his gaze lingered on certain items: the locked cabinet containing premium tobacco, the small safe behind the counter, the ledger where she recorded transactions. His evaluation was calculating but crude compared to the sophisticated assessment she would have conducted in her former life. "We're honored by your interest," she responded, infusing her voice with just enough tremulous sarcasm to be perceived as the harmless defiance of an elderly woman rather than genuine challenge. Durant's smile tightened. "Honor's got nothing to do with it, Mrs. Blackwell. Business opportunity is what brings me here." He leaned across the counter, intentionally invading her space. "Speaking of business, I've been considering our arrangement. $10 weekly seems insufficient given current economic conditions." Martha allowed herself to appear momentarily distressed. "But Mr. Durant, we agreed—" "Market fluctuations, Mrs. Blackwell," he interrupted smoothly. "Costs of providing quality protection have increased. $20 weekly seems more appropriate now." The doubling of his demand so quickly revealed much about Durant's character and intentions. This wasn't just about extorting money. It was about establishing dominance, demonstrating that agreements with him were subject to change at his whim, a tactic designed to create powerlessness in his victims. 3 decades earlier, men employing such tactics against the Black Rose had typically met remarkably creative ends. Martha suppressed that thought, maintaining her role as the intimidated widow. I don't see how I can possibly afford—" The sharp crack of Durant's hand slamming onto the counter cut off her protest. The sound echoed through the store, deliberate intimidation. "Perhaps I haven't made myself clear," he said, voice hardening. "This isn't a negotiation. $20 weekly starting now." His hand moved to the small safe behind the counter. "I assume today's payment is secured here." Martha hesitated, perfectly simulating the uncertainty of someone weighing limited options. In reality, she was calculating several potential responses, assessing each for its impact on her cover identity and longer-term strategy. "The combination," Durant prompted, impatience edging his tone. With apparent reluctance, Martha recited the numbers that would open the safe, not the actual combination, but one that would trigger a small mechanism she had installed years ago as a precaution. The device wouldn't harm Durant, merely create a momentary distraction if needed. Durant turned the dial with confidence, then frowned when the safe failed to open. "You're trying my patience, Mrs. Blackwell." "My memory isn't what it once was." Martha apologized, the perfect image of elderly forgetfulness. "Perhaps it was." She recited the actual combination, maintaining the tremor in her voice. The safe opened, revealing modest cash reserves, sufficient for a small business, but far less than the substantial amount Martha actually kept hidden in various locations throughout the building. Durant counted out $20 with deliberate slowness, his actions meant to emphasize his control over her resources. "Same time next week," he stated, pocketing the money. And Mrs. Blackwell, I'd advise against mentioning our business relationship to anyone who might be passing through, particularly anyone wearing a badge. The threat was obvious. Martha nodded meekly, though her mind was already formulating approaches to addressing the Durant problem. The man was becoming more dangerous than she had initially assessed, not because of his capabilities, which remained crude by her standards, but because of his unpredictability and apparently increasing instability. "Now then," Durant continued, his manner shifting to false joviality, "I've been considering the broader commercial opportunities in Redemption Creek. Your establishment occupies a prime location at the edge of town. First business travelers see when arriving from this east. Valuable positioning." Martha felt the first genuine flicker of concern. If Durant was considering property acquisition rather than simple extortion, his intentions for Redemption Creek were more ambitious than she had anticipated. This wasn't a simple criminal operation. It was the beginning of a territorial grab. "The store has been in my late husband's family for generations," she responded, deliberately missing Durant's implication. "Everything has its price, Mrs. Blackwell." Durant's gaze swept the store once more, assessing its contents with proprietary interest. "I'll be making you an offer soon. I suggest you consider it carefully when it comes." After Durant departed, Martha moved methodically through her closing routine, locking the front door despite the early hour and turning the sign to closed. Only when she was certain she was unobserved did she allow her posture to straighten, the carefully maintained tremor leaving her hands as she descended to her hidden basement. The space was cool and dimly lit, smelling of gun oil and old leather. Martha moved to a concealed cabinet, removing a wooden box that contained special stationery and several bottles of ink she had maintained for specific purposes. Seating herself at a small writing desk, she composed 4 identical messages in a precise cipher she had developed during her years leading the Madison Raiders. The messages contained no signature, no identifying information that would connect them to Martha Blackwell of Redemption Creek. They did, however, include specific phrases and reference points that would be immediately recognizable to the recipients, former lieutenants of the Madison Raiders who had scattered across the Western Territories following the gang's carefully orchestrated dissolution 30 years earlier. These weren't panicked pleas for help. Martha Madison had never begged for assistance in her life. They measured tactical communications, providing coordinates, timeline estimates, and specific situational details that her former subordinates would recognize as a strategic assessment rather than an emotional appeal. After allowing the ink to dry, Martha sealed each message in an unmarked envelope and tucked them into her dress pocket. Tomorrow's stage would carry these communications to specific drop points, where they would eventually reach their intended recipients. She harbored no illusions that all would respond. 3 decades was a long time, and some might have died, been imprisoned, or created new lives too valuable to risk. But she knew with absolute certainty that at least some would come. The Black Rose had inspired that kind of loyalty. With that contingency in place, Martha turned her attention to more immediate preparations. Durant's visit had confirmed her assessment of escalating threat levels. The gang would establish patterns of movement over the coming days, consolidating their control over Redemption Creek through systematic intimidation and strategic violence against selected targets. She had observed similar operations many times, both as perpetrator and witness. The playbook was predictable, which gave her certain advantages in formulating countermeasures. She would need to prepare without revealing capabilities inconsistent with Martha Blackwell's persona. Moving to a hidden storage area, Martha retrieved items she had accumulated over 15 years. Materials that would seem innocuous individually, but could be combined to create specific tactical advantages. Cord that appeared to be simple twine, but possessed tensile strength sufficient to restrain a grown man. chemical compounds disguised as ordinary cleaning supplies that could create disorienting smoke or temporary blindness when combined. Mechanical components concealed within everyday objects that could be assembled into specialized tools or weapons. Martha worked methodically through the afternoon, preparing contingencies while tracking the movements of Durant's men through subtle observations. When young Timothy Fletcher delivered afternoon mail, she gathered valuable intelligence through seemingly casual inquiries about activities in town. "They've taken over the saloon," Timothy reported, eyes wide with the excitement of dangerous developments. "Pa says they're drinking free and nobody dares stop them. They beat up Mr. Peterson from the bank when he complained about them scaring customers." Martha clucked sympathetically while mentally adding this information to her developing understanding of Durant's operation. The pattern was emerging clearly: systematic intimidation of key businesses, neutralization of civil authority through incapacitating Sheriff Wilson, and establishment of a central headquarters at the saloon with excellent visibility of the town's main thoroughfare. "Is the sheriff doing any better?" she asked, handing Timothy a piece of hard candy as reward for his intelligence work, though the boy didn't recognize it as such. "Doc Sullivan says the bullet went clean through, no serious damage," Timothy replied, pocketing the candy. "But those men posted someone outside the doctor's office watching. The sheriff can't leave without them knowing." Tactical containment of law enforcement, another predictable but effective strategy. Durant might lack sophistication, but he understood fundamental principles of territorial control. Martha was revising her initial assessment of him as merely an opportunistic thug. The man had a crude but effective strategic mind. As evening approached, Martha completed her preparations and ascended to the main store to maintain her established patterns of behavior. Any deviation might attract unwanted attention. From her window, she observed Durant's men patrolling Main Street in pairs, their presence creating a palpable tension that hung over Redemption Creek like storm clouds. The sound of breaking glass and raised voices carried from the direction of the saloon, Durant's men enjoying their newfound power through petty destruction and intimidation. Martha watched impassively, her expression revealing nothing of the cold calculation taking place behind her elderly facade. Durant's operation was following a predictable trajectory, which allowed her to anticipate his next moves with reasonable accuracy. He would continue consolidating control through escalating displays of dominance, targeting anyone who showed resistance. Within days, he would begin more systematic exploitation of the town's resources, likely focusing on the bank and larger commercial operations first. Martha's immediate concern was maintaining her cover while implementing measured countermeasures. Too much resistance too quickly would attract unwanted attention. Too little would allow Durant to establish entrenched control that would be more difficult to dismantle. As darkness fell over Redemption Creek, Martha lit a single lamp in her front window, maintaining the appearance of an elderly woman preparing for a quiet evening. In reality, she was making final adjustments to specialized tools she had assembled from seemingly innocent components. The sharp rap at her door came precisely when she had anticipated it would. Durant's men had established regular patrol patterns, and she had calculated this visit would occur during their eastern circuit of the town. Setting aside her work, Martha quickly resumed her elderly persona, stooping her shoulders and adjusting her spectacles before shuffling to answer the door. The man standing on her porch wasn't Durant, but his lieutenant, Cummings, a broad-shouldered brute whose reputation for unnecessary cruelty preceded him. Behind him stood two others, their postures suggesting they anticipated entertainment from this encounter. "Evening, Mrs. Blackwell," Cummings greeted her with mock politeness. "Mr. Durant sent us to ensure your establishment is secure for the night. Dangerous times, after all," Martha recognized the pretext for what it was, a barely disguised justification for entering and searching her property. Durant was likely seeking additional leverage or resources he could exploit. "How thoughtful," she replied, her voice carrying the perfect blend of elderly wariness and resignation. "Though I was just preparing for bed." "This won't take but a minute," Cummings assured her, already pushing past into the store without waiting for an invitation. His companions followed, spreading out to examine different sections with the practiced efficiency of experienced thieves assessing potential value. Martha observed their movements carefully, noting which items attracted their attention. Cummings moved directly to the cabinet containing premium liquor, while another examined the tobacco products. The third moved toward the back room, where her private quarters connected to the store. "That area's private," Martha protested with seemingly feeble indignation. "A lady's personal space shouldn't be invaded by strangers." Cummings laughed, the sound carrying genuine amusement at her apparent helplessness. "We're being thorough, Mrs. Blackwell. Mr. Durant insists on complete security assessments." The man continued toward her back room, forcing Martha to make a rapid tactical decision. The basement entrance was well concealed, but a thorough search might reveal inconsistencies in her carefully maintained cover identity. She needed to redirect their attention without appearing to have the capability to do so. With perfectly timed accidental clumsiness, Martha bumped against a shelf, sending several glass bottles crashing to the floor. The noise created the desired distraction, drawing all three men's attention momentarily. "My goodness!" she exclaimed, the picture of elderly distress. "My poor coordination. Please be careful of the glass." The diversion took only seconds, but Martha used them efficiently, knocking over a small container of coal oil that spread rapidly toward a lit lamp. The resulting flare-up created a momentary panic as Cummings and his men scrambled to prevent a fire that would consume both the store and their opportunity for plunder. "Water behind the counter," Martha directed, pointing to buckets she kept prepared for precisely such staged incidents. In the confusion of extinguishing the small blaze, the search lost its methodical nature. By the time order was restored, Martha had successfully redirected their focus through apparent helplessness rather than obvious resistance. "Clumsy old woman," Cummings muttered, though his expression suggested uncertainty about whether the incident had been entirely accidental. "You could burn down the whole damn town." "My nerves aren't what they once were," Martha apologized, wringing her hands with apparent distress. "Having strangers in my store after hours, it's unsettling." Cummings studied her for a moment, his expression suggesting he was re-evaluating something about her. Martha maintained her elderly demeanor perfectly, revealing nothing of the calculated assessment taking place behind her spectacles. "We'll continue our security inspection another "In time," he finally announced, his tone carrying a threat beneath the surface courtesy. "Mr. Durant will want to know about this incident." After they departed, Martha moved quickly to implement additional precautions. The encounter had confirmed her assessment that Durant's interest extended beyond simple extortion to detailed intelligence gathering about her operation. This suggested he had longer-term plans for her property specifically. Working efficiently in the darkness, she positioned several innocuous-appearing objects that would serve as early warning systems. If anyone attempted to enter the store overnight, a loose floorboard that would creak distinctively, a small bell disguised within a decorative arrangement, thin threads across potential entry points that would break silently if disturbed. As she completed these preparations, Martha allowed herself a brief moment of reflection. 30 years had passed since she had employed such tactics as the Black Rose, yet the skills remained sharp, the strategic thinking unblemished by time. She had chosen retirement and obscurity, but had never truly stopped being the tactician who had orchestrated the most elaborate criminal operation the Western Territories had ever known. The dusty streets of Redemption Creek lay quiet beneath. The moonlight, the town's residents secured behind locked doors as Durant's men patrolled with the confidence of conquerors. Little did they realize that within this seemingly vulnerable community, within the very building they had marked as an easy target, lived a legend whose strategic brilliance had once confounded the most determined lawman across 3 territories. Frank. Durant believed he was establishing dominance over a frightened, aging widow. In reality, he was unwittingly challenging the most dangerous opponent he would ever face, a woman whose former identity had been spoken of in whispers around campfires, whose tactical genius had become the stuff of frontier legend. Martha. Blackwell extinguished her lamp and moved to the window, watching Durant's men complete their patrol circuit. Her expression in the darkness carried none of the fear or resignation she had projected earlier. Instead, her eyes held the cold calculation of a strategist assessing the board before making her first decisive move. The Durant gang had established their presence and declared their intentions. Now the true contest would begin, one they had no idea they had entered, against an opponent they couldn't possibly recognize until it was far too late. The morning stage departed Redemption Creek at precisely 6 o'clock, carrying Martha's unmarked messages along with the regular mail. She had risen before dawn to ensure her communications would be among the parcels, paying the sleepy-eyed postal clerk extra to handle them with discretion. To anyone observing, she appeared to be simply sending correspondence, perhaps to distant relatives. Nothing that would attract attention in a frontier town where personal business remained private. By unspoken agreement, with that contingency in motion, Martha turned her attention to more immediate concerns. Durant's men had established a checkpoint near the livery stable, monitoring all traffic in and out of town. The blockade wasn't complete. Such an obvious restriction would attract unwanted attention from territorial authorities, but it created a choke point through which all significant movement was observed and catalogued. Martha noted these developments from her position behind the store counter, gathering intelligence through seemingly innocent conversations with customers. The town's mood had shifted overnight from initial alarm to a resigned acceptance that Martha recognized from communities she had targeted in her former life. Fear was giving way to accommodation, the first stage of surrender to new authority. They've taken rooms at all 3 boarding houses, Harriet Wilson, the sheriff's wife, reported while purchasing coffee beans, positioning themselves throughout town rather than concentrating in one location. Martha nodded sympathetically while mentally adding this information to her tactical assessment. Durant was employing basic military strategy, distributing his forces to maximize surveillance coverage while maintaining rapid response capability through their patrol patterns. Not sophisticated, but effective for controlling a small town with minimal resistance. "How is the sheriff recovering?" Martha inquired, carefully measuring coffee beans with hands she allowed to tremble slightly. Harriet's expression tightened. "The wound itself is healing well, but they've stationed a man directly outside Doc Sullivan's office. Thomas can't leave without them knowing, and anyone visiting him is questioned afterward. Continued neutralization of legitimate authority, predictable but concerning." Martha had calculated that Sheriff Wilson might provide a rallying point for resistance if his recovery proceeded quickly. Durant's containment strategy limited that possibility, forcing Martha to adjust her assessment of available community resources. The bell above the door chimed, announcing the arrival of young Deputy Morris, his inexperience evident in the nervous adjustment of his gun belt and the uncertainty in his expression. Martha immediately recognized a tactical opportunity. The young man clearly sought guidance, and his position within law enforcement could prove valuable. "Deputy," she greeted him with grandmotherly warmth. What brings you to my humble establishment? This morning? Morris removed his hat, fidgeting with the brim. Just checking on you, Mrs. Blackwell, making my rounds to ensure everyone's managing all right with our visitors. Martha noted the hesitation in his phrasing, visitors rather than criminals or outlaws, suggesting he had already been intimidated into moderated language. The deputy was scared, operating without direction in the sheriff's absence, and seeking reassurance rather than providing it. "Would you care for some coffee, deputy?" Martha offered, gesturing to the pot she kept warming on the small stove behind the counter. "It helps clear the mind in troubled times." As Morris accepted the coffee with visible gratitude, Martha assessed him with the practiced eye of someone who had once selected recruits for the most disciplined outlaw gang in the territories. The young man possessed certain promising qualities beneath his nervousness: observant eyes, a natural caution that could be developed into tactical awareness, and most importantly, a genuine commitment to justice that hadn't yet been corrupted by fear or compromise. "Difficult position you're in," she observed, pouring herself a cup as well. "Maintaining order with the sheriff injured and these men asserting themselves throughout town." Morris stared into his coffee. "Don't rightly know what to do, Mrs. Blackwell. I've sent telegrams to the Territorial Marshal's office, but responses have been non-committal. Sheriff Wilson tells me to avoid direct confrontation until we have sufficient reinforcements." "Wise counsel," Martha agreed, her voice carrying just enough steel beneath her grandmotherly tone to catch Morris's attention. "Direct confrontation with superior forces rarely ends well, but that doesn't mean one must simply surrender." The deputy looked up, sudden interest kindling in his expression. "Ma'am?" Martha sipped her coffee, allowing the moment to develop naturally. "My late husband served with the Texas Rangers before we married," she offered, seamlessly integrating this fabrication into her established background. He often spoke of situations where lawmen were outnumbered by hostile forces, said the key was patience, observation, and preparation rather than premature action. This approach accomplished multiple objectives simultaneously. It established Martha as someone with indirect knowledge of law enforcement tactics rather than personal experience, maintaining her cover identity. It positioned her as a potential advisor to the young deputy without appearing to assert authority. Most importantly, it allowed her to begin shaping Morris's approach to the Durant situation towards strategies that would complement her own developing plans. "Preparation?" Morris asked, leaning forward slightly. Martha set down her cup. "Knowledge is the foundation of effective action, deputy. Understanding your opponent's patterns, strengths, weaknesses, and intentions before attempting to counter them." As she spoke, Martha allowed the slightest hint of her true persona to surface, not in any obvious break of character, but in the precision of her analysis and the authoritative undertone in her guidance. To the deputy, she remained a kindly widow sharing second-hand wisdom. Only someone who had known the Black Rose in her prime might have recognized the shadow of the legendary tactician beneath Martha's carefully maintained elderly demeanor. "Durant's men have established regular patrol patterns," she continued, her observation disguised as casual notice. "They pass my store at past each hour during daylight, less predictably after dark. They've positioned observers at key locations: Andug, the telegraph office, the bank, the stagecoach station, and maintain a presence near Doc Sullivan's to monitor the sheriff." Morris blinked, clearly surprised by the thoroughness of her observations. "You've noticed all that, just from your store window?" Martha smiled, the expression carefully calibrated to suggest elderly pride rather than strategic acumen. "When you get to my age, watching the town becomes a primary form of entertainment. One notices patterns." Before Morris could respond, the door opened again, admitting Frank Durant himself. The gang leader paused momentarily upon seeing the deputy, then continued inside with exaggerated cordiality. "Deputy Morris," he greeted, tipping his hat with mock respect. "Wonderful to see our local law enforcement attending to the welfare of vulnerable citizens." Martha noted the calculated intimidation in Durant's approach, interrupting a private conversation, establishing dominance through subtle mockery, forcing the deputy into a reactive position. She had employed similar tactics herself in another life to destabilize opposition before negotiations. Morris stiffened, his hand instinctively moving toward his sidearm before stopping, a hesitation that revealed his uncertainty and telegraphed. "Weakness to Durant." "Mr. Durant," the deputy acknowledged, his attempt at authoritative greeting undermined by the slight tremor in his voice. "I trust you're not harassing Mrs. Blackwell with official business," Durant continued, moving to position himself physically between Morris and Martha. "The poor woman has enough concerns without dealing with bureaucratic matters." The spatial dominance was deliberate, separating potential allies, asserting control over the interaction. Martha recognized each element of Durant's approach, having refined such techniques herself during the Madison Raiders' operations. His execution lacked the subtlety she would have employed, but achieved its primary objective as Morris visibly retreated from confrontation. "Just checking on citizens' welfare," the deputy muttered, setting down his half-finished coffee. "Part of my rounds," Durant smiled, the expression not reaching his eyes. "Commendable dedication, though perhaps your attention would be better directed toward the saloon. Some disagreement among the poker players threatens to become disruptive." The dismissal was thinly veiled, the manufactured distraction obvious to Martha's experienced assessment. Durant wanted the deputy removed from her store, likely to conduct business he preferred not to have witnessed by law enforcement, however ineffectual. Morris hesitated, looking at Martha with an unspoken question in his expression. She recognized the critical moment. The deputy was seeking direction, offering potential alliance if she provided the necessary guidance. The tactical opportunity was substantial, but came with significant risk if Durant perceived her influence. "You should attend to your duties, deputy," Martha suggested, her tone grandmotherly rather than commanding. "Perhaps stop by later if your rounds bring you this way again." The phrasing was deliberate, seemingly supportive of Morris's departure while establishing expectation of his return. A subtle counter to Durant's attempt at isolation, but not overt enough to reveal strategic thinking beyond an elderly woman's normal concerns. After Morris departed, Durant's demeanor shifted perceptibly. The false courtesy remained, but beneath it Martha detected heightened calculation as he studied her with greater intensity than previous encounters. "Awfully friendly with local law enforcement," he observed, moving behind her counter without invitation, a deliberate territorial assertion. Martha allowed herself to appear mildly flustered by this invasion of her space. "Deputy Morris is a kind young man. Check on us older residents regularly." "Generous of him," Durant replied, his attention now focused on examining items beneath her counter. The cash box, receipt ledger, and various store documents. "Though I wonder what you two find so interesting to discuss over morning coffee." The implicit accusation suggested Durant possessed greater perceptive capabilities than Martha had initially assessed. He had recognized something in her interaction with Morris that triggered suspicion, perhaps the deputy's attentiveness to her words, or some momentary slip in her elderly persona during their conversation. Tactical adjustment was necessary. Martha deliberately knocked over a small container of pencils, creating minor confusion as they scattered across the counter. The apparent clumsiness served multiple purposes, reinforcing her image as a frail, elderly woman, creating distraction from Durant's implied question and allowing her to physically reclaim space as she gathered the spilled items. "Oh dear, my poor coordination," she fussed, moving into Durant's personal space with the presumptive privilege of age. Deputy Morris was simply inquiring about my health, as he does with all the town's elderly, so considerate of the young man. Durant stepped back slightly, the instinctive reaction to perceived harmlessness that Martha had cultivated through years of maintaining her cover identity. The minor victory gave her an opportunity to redirect the interaction. "What brings you to my humble establishment this morning, Mr. Durant? Your men already collected your protection payment yesterday." Durant regained his composure, though Martha noted the slight narrowing of his eyes, reassessing something about her that he couldn't quite articulate. "Just ensuring all protected businesses receive appropriate attention. My men reported some clumsiness with fire hazards last night." The reference to her staged distraction during the previous evening's inspection confirmed Martha's assessment that Cummings had reported the incident to Durant. The gang leader was probing, seeking to determine whether the accident had been genuine or calculated resistance. "My aging eyes don't see as well after dark," Martha explained, allowing embarrassment to color her tone. "A terrible accident. I've always been fearful of fire. Lost my first husband to a barn blaze back in Kansas." The fabricated personal detail served as calculated misdirection, providing plausible explanation for her apparent nervousness while offering seemingly intimate information that reinforced her cover identity. Durant's expression suggested the approach was effective, his suspicion visibly diminishing. "Understandable concern," he acknowledged, moving toward the premium tobacco cabinet. "Mind if I sample your merchandise? As a potential investor in your establishment, I should evaluate the quality of your inventory." The phrasing confirmed Martha's earlier assessment that Durant's interest extended beyond simple extortion to acquisition of property. He was positioning himself as a businessman rather than mere bandit, a pattern Martha recognized from territorial takeovers she had observed in mining communities during her former life. "Investor?" she questioned, allowing appropriate elderly confusion to color her expression. Durant selected an expensive cigar without waiting for permission, examining it with apparent connoisseurship that Martha recognized as affected rather than genuine. "Redemption Creek has significant commercial potential, Mrs. Blackwell. I've been acquiring interests in several local establishments. Your store occupies an advantageous position that would complement my portfolio." As he spoke, Durant extracted a folded document from his vest pocket, spreading it on the counter with deliberate ceremony. "A formal offer for your business. Fair market value, plus generous consideration for immediate vacancy of the attached living quarters." Martha examined the document while maintaining her elderly persona, noting the legitimately drafted legal language that suggested Durant employed professional assistance in his acquisition strategy. The amount offered was substantial on paper, though Martha recognized the likelihood that payment would never materialize once she surrendered her property. "This is all very sudden," she protested, her voice wavering with convincing distress. "The store is my home, my livelihood. I wouldn't know where to go or what to do at my age." Durant lit the cigar without requesting permission, filling the store with aromatic smoke. "Progress waits for no one, Mrs. Blackwell. Redemption Creek is changing. You can benefit from that change or be disadvantaged by it." The threat beneath his offer was hardly subtle. Martha recognized the standard approach: present the illusion of choice while making clear that resistance would bring escalating consequences. Durant was accelerating his timeline, moving from protection rackets to property acquisition more quickly than she had anticipated. "I'll need time to consider," she responded, carefully calibrating her tone to suggest reluctant consideration rather than outright refusal. "Of course," Durant agreed with false magnanimity. 2 days should be sufficient for a simple business decision. I'll return Thursday morning for your answer." He tapped the document meaningfully, I encourage you to recognize the generosity of my offer. The alternative would be unfortunate. After Durant departed, Martha maintained her distressed, elderly demeanor for several minutes, aware that his men likely observed the store from positions along Main Street. Only when sufficient time had passed did she retrieve the purchase offer from the counter, examining it with the expert assessment of someone who had created and disbanded multiple business fronts during her criminal career. The document revealed useful intelligence about Durant's operation. The legal structure referenced a mining development company incorporated in Colorado Territory, suggesting his criminal activities were disguised beneath legitimate business interests. The corporate structure named several partners beyond Durant himself, potentially identifying financial backers or political connections supporting his territorial expansion. Most significantly, the purchase offer targeted not just her store, but adjacent properties along Redemption Creek's eastern approach, indicating a strategic acquisition pattern consistent with development plans rather than simple criminal opportunism. Durant wasn't just a bandit. He was operating as the visible representative of larger commercial interests, using criminal tactics to acquire property at artificially depressed values. This revelation necessitated tactical recalibration. Martha had initially assessed Durant as a sophisticated criminal employing extortion and intimidation for immediate profit. His actual operation appeared more complex, using criminal methods to serve longer-term business objectives. This suggested greater resources and potential political protection than she had calculated in her initial response planning. The afternoon brought additional confirmation as Martha observed Durant meeting with prominent businessmen from neighboring communities who arrived via private coach rather than public stagecoach. The gathering occurred at the town's small hotel, with Durant's men establishing security perimeters that prevented ordinary citizens from approaching. Through casual conversation with Millicent Harper, the hotel proprietor's wife who stopped by the store for emergency supplies, Martha gathered critical intelligence about the visitors. Representatives from the Territorial Railroad Commission, Millicent whispered, leaning across the counter. Anderson says they're discussing a potential spur line to connect Redemption Creek to the main route. Would transform the entire region. If it happens, Martha absorbed this information with outward amazement and inner strategic assessment. A railroad connection would increase property values exponentially, explaining Durant's aggressive acquisition timeline. The involvement of territorial commissioners suggested political connections beyond local influence, potentially complicating Martha's developing countermeasures. As darkness fell, Martha closed her store at the usual time, maintaining established patterns while finalizing her preparations for the evening's activities. Durant's accelerated timeline necessitated more direct intelligence gathering than she had initially planned. Tonight would require her first significant deviation from Martha Blackwell's established routines, a calculated risk, but necessary. Given the evolving situation, after ensuring she was unobserved, Martha descended to her basement sanctuary. The familiar preparations brought memories flooding back, rituals she had performed countless times before high-risk operations during her years as the Black Rose. Her movements were practiced, efficient, the decades falling away as muscle. Memory reasserted itself. From a hidden compartment came specialized clothing, not the black leather that had been her signature as a younger woman, but dark, practical garments that would allow movement and concealment while remaining consistent, with items an elderly shopkeeper might reasonably possess. Modified gloves protected her hands while obscuring fingerprints. A dark shawl wrapped around her head would conceal her distinctive silver hair. Her preparations complete, Martha waited patiently for full darkness and the transition between Durant's evening patrol shifts, a 20-minute window she had identified through careful observation. When the optimal moment arrived, she exited through a concealed rear passage that emerged behind the livery stable, well away from established patrol routes. Moving through Redemption Creek's shadows with silent efficiency that would have astounded anyone familiar only with Martha Blackwell's apparent frailty, she navigated to her first objective, the town's small hotel where Durant had conducted his business meetings. The building was dark, except for lights in the private dining room, where Durant and his associates continued their discussions. Martha positioned herself near an unlatched window, her breathing controlled to silent steadiness as she listened to conversations never intended for public hearing. The territorial governor has guaranteed regulatory approval once property acquisition reaches the 60% threshold, an unfamiliar voice stated. Durant's methods are delivering results ahead of the projected timeline. Local resistance? Another voice inquired. Minimal, Durant's distinctive tone responded. Sheriffs incapacitated. Community leadership is fragmented. We've encountered nothing beyond token protests easily overcome through standard persuasion. Techniques? The eastern properties remain critical, the first voice insisted, particularly the mercantile at the town approach. Without clear title to those parcels, the depot location becomes problematic. I've made a formal offer on the mercantile, Durant assured them. The widow who owns it will accept it by Thursday. If not, alternative acquisition methods will be employed. The conversation confirmed Martha's revised assessment. Durant operated as the enforcement arm of a sophisticated commercial operation with significant political connections. The railroad development explained both the aggressive timeline and the resources supporting Durant's criminal activities. What appeared to the townspeople as simple banditry was actually calculated commercial terrorism with official protection. Having gathered essential intelligence, Martha withdrew as silently as she had arrived, moving to her second objective, the telegraph office where Durant's men maintained continuous surveillance. The office's strategic importance was obvious. Control of communications prevented organized resistance, while ensuring Durant's operation received advance warning of any official response to their activities. Martha observed the building from shadow, noting the positioned guards and security measures with professional assessment. Durant's men maintained reasonable vigilance, but lacked the disciplined rotation and overlapping fields of observation that would have made the position truly secure. Their confidence had bred complacency, a vulnerability she had exploited many times during her former career. When the guard stepped away briefly to light a cigarette, Martha moved with decisive efficiency, extracting a small mirror and wire tool from her pocket. The modified instruments allowed her to visually inspect the interior while manipulating the simple lock mechanism without direct contact. Within moments, she had accessed the day's telegraph records, memorizing key communications before returning. Everything to its original position. The telegrams confirmed her intelligence assessment. Official communications to territorial authorities regarding Durant's activities were being intercepted, with responses either modified or fabricated entirely. More significantly, regular reports were being transmitted to financial interests in Denver, providing updates on property acquisition progress and potential resistance points. Martha had gathered critical intelligence without detection, but as she prepared to withdraw, a patrol deviation threatened her operation. Two of Durant's men approached the telegraph office from an unexpected direction, their timing inconsistent with established patterns. The anomaly suggested either random variation or, more concerning, an intentional security adjustment based on suspected surveillance. Martha made instantaneous tactical assessment, calculating available concealment options against the patrol's projected route. Direct evasion carried unacceptable discovery risk. Alternative approach was necessary. Drawing her shawl forward to obscure her features, Martha deliberately altered her posture to mimic elderly frailty. emerging from shadow as if she had simply been walking along the darkened street. The transformation was comprehensive. Gait, posture, even breathing patterns, adjusting to project the Martha Blackwell persona in its most vulnerable manifestation. "Oh!" she exclaimed as the patrol rounded the corner, her voice carrying a perfectly calibrated elderly surprise. "Goodness, you startled me." Durant's men reacted with momentary confusion, clearly unprepared to encounter the elderly shopkeeper wandering alone after dark. "Mrs. Blackwell?" one questioned, hand moving instinctively toward his weapon before recognizing her. "What are you doing out at this hour?" Martha clutched her shawl with apparently trembling hands. "My sleeping powders," she explained, infusing, her voice with embarrassed distress. "Can't rest without them, though the doctor might still be attending poor Sheriff Wilson and could provide my usual prescription." Indeed, the explanation was perfectly tailored, consistent with an elderly woman's known medical needs, aligned with established community knowledge about the sheriff's situation, and providing plausible reason for her nighttime presence without suggesting capability or purpose beyond innocent necessity. "Doctor's office is in the other direction," the second man pointed out, suspicion evident in his tone. Martha blinked in apparent confusion, then pressed a hand to her forehead. "Oh dear, you're absolutely right. My poor mind gets so turned around after dark. Age isn't kind to one's sense of direction." The performance achieved its objective. Durant's men exchanged glances that communicated a dismissive assessment of the confused old woman rather than a potential security threat. "We'll escort you home, Mrs. Blackwell," the first offered, his tone suggesting irritated obligation rather than genuine concern. "Not safe for you to be wandering around confused." "So kind," Martha murmured, maintaining her disoriented elderly persona while inwardly calculating tactical advantage from the unexpected escort. Their route would reveal additional patrol patterns and security positions she hadn't yet mapped. As Durant's men accompanied her back to the general store, Martha maintained a seemingly innocent conversation that yielded additional intelligence. Confirmation of total force strength, rotation schedules, and most significantly, the arrival of additional personnel expected the following day. At her door, Martha fumbled with her keys in apparent elderly clumsiness, forcing one of Durant's men to assist with unlocking her own store. The interaction reinforced their perception of her harmlessness, while allowing her to assess his reaction time and weapons positioning from intimate proximity. "Thank you so much," she effused as they departed, watching through narrowed eyes as they resumed their patrol route. Only when they had disappeared from view did Martha's posture straighten, her expression shifting from confused gratitude to cold calculation. The night's activities had confirmed her revised assessment of Durant's operation while providing critical intelligence for developing countermeasures. The situation was more complex than initial appearance. Not simple criminal extortion, but organized commercial terrorism with political protection and financial backing. Martha secured her store and returned to her hidden basement, recording her observations in a cipher notebook with the methodical precision that had once made the Black Rose the most successful outlaw leader in the territories. The Madison Raiders had faced similar opposition during their operational years. Corrupt business interests using hired enforcers to achieve commercial objectives through intimidation and violence. The parallel was ironic. Martha had once employed comparable tactics herself, albeit with greater subtlety and strategic sophistication. Now she found herself planning resistance against methods she had helped pioneer decades earlier. As she reviewed her intelligence and formulated response options, Martha allowed herself a moment of grim amusement at the situation's irony. Durant and his associates believed themselves clever predators, exploiting a vulnerable community through superior force and intimidation. They couldn't possibly imagine that their seemingly easiest target, an elderly widow running a modest general store, was in reality the legendary strategist who had written the very playbook they were now employing with such crude imitation. Tomorrow would require careful balance, maintaining her cover identity while implementing initial countermeasures against Durant's operation. The challenge invigorated her, awakening strategic capabilities long dormant beneath Martha Blackwell's carefully crafted persona. The Black Rose might have disappeared from wanted posters decades ago, but her tactical brilliance remained undiminished by time. As Martha extinguished her lamp and prepared for a few hours' rest before dawn, her expression in the darkness held none of the fear or confusion she had projected earlier. Instead, her eyes reflected cold calculation and the first glimmering of something she hadn't experienced in years, the anticipation of worthy opposition. 30 years earlier, the name Black Rose Madison had been whispered with a mixture of fear and reverence across 3 territories. Unlike the brutal male-dominated gangs that relied on violence and intimidation, Martha Madison had revolutionized criminal enterprise through strategic brilliance and organizational discipline. The daughter of a Union Army quartermaster, Martha had grown up studying military logistics and tactical planning at her father's side during the Civil War. When peace came, her extraordinary mind found little acceptable outlet in a society that offered women few opportunities beyond domestic life. Marriage to a promising young cavalry officer named Thomas Madison seemed her only path to applying her talents, as he recognized and valued her strategic capabilities in private while presenting conventional appearances in public. Their partnership flourished until a Comanche raid left Thomas dead and Martha wounded on the Texas frontier. Military authorities dismissed her reports about corrupt officers who had deliberately withheld reinforcements after being bribed by local cattle interests who wanted the land cleared. The official narrative blamed poor planning by her husband, rather than acknowledging the conspiracy that had sacrificed a dozen good men. That injustice transformed Martha Madison. If legitimate authority would serve corrupt interests, she would build her own organization based on disciplined loyalty and strategic excellence. The Madison Raiders emerged not as common bandits, but as a sophisticated criminal enterprise targeting the very financial and commercial interests that had corrupted justice. For a decade, the Black Rose's operations set new standards for criminal innovation. Railroad payrolls, bank shipments, and mining company strongboxes disappeared with such strategic precision that law enforcement often didn't realize they'd been robbed until days later. Her signature methods became legendary: elaborate diversions, psychological manipulation of targets, and flawless execution that left minimal evidence. Most distinctive was her approach to personnel. While other outlaw leaders recruited the violent and desperate, Martha selected for intelligence and trainability. Her raiders operated with military discipline, each understanding their role within complex operations. Violence remained a last resort, precisely applied when necessary rather than employed as primary methodology. The Black Rose's personal signature became the card she left in emptied safes, not as theatrical bravado, but as deliberate psychological operation against financial institutions. The signature created the impression of a vast criminal network, where in reality Martha employed relatively few people, each extensively trained and absolutely loyal. At the height of her success, the Madison Raiders controlled criminal operations across Colorado, Wyoming, and Utah territories with minimal bloodshed and maximum efficiency. Law enforcement agencies offered unprecedented rewards for information leading to the Black Rose's capture, while financial institutions implemented increasingly elaborate security measures that Martha typically bypassed through intelligence rather than force. The operation's remarkable discipline meant that over 10 years, not a single member of the Madison Raiders faced successful prosecution. Those occasionally captured either maintained silence or had been provided with carefully limited information that revealed nothing about the organization's structure or leadership. Then, at the apex of her criminal career, Martha Madison vanished. Completely, the Madison Raiders disbanded almost overnight, leaving law enforcement baffled by their sudden disappearance. Theories proliferated that the Black Rose had been killed by rivals, had fled to Mexico with accumulated wealth, or had been secretly captured by Pinkertons who concealed their success to avoid admitting prior failures. The truth was known only to Martha herself. A routine intelligence-gathering operation had uncovered evidence of her own approaching mortality. A medical diagnosis suggesting limited remaining years. Faced with inevitable physical decline that would compromise her leadership capabilities, Martha made a strategic decision to dissolve her criminal empire at its height rather than risk its deterioration. With characteristic thoroughness, she orchestrated the Madison Raiders' disappearance. Key lieutenants received generous final payments and instructions for establishing legitimate lives. Financial reserves were dispersed through elaborate channels that obscured their origins. Physical evidence was systematically destroyed. Within 6 months, one of the most successful criminal enterprises in Western history had vanished as completely as if it had never existed. Martha herself underwent the first of several identity transformations, beginning with Sarah Collins, a respectable widow who resided briefly in San Francisco while undergoing medical treatment that proved more successful than initially expected. When her health stabilized, she moved through successive identities: Elizabeth Parker, a boarding house proprietor in Denver; Catherine Wells, a dressmaker in Santa Fe; and finally, Martha Blackwell, who appeared in Redemption Creek 15 years ago with sufficient capital to purchase the struggling general store. Throughout these transformations, Martha maintained contact with a select few former lieutenants, who had proven absolutely loyal during the Madison Raiders' operational years. These connections remained dormant but viable, a hibernating network that could be reactivated if necessary. The messages she had dispatched via the morning stage were reaching precisely these individuals, not with desperate pleas for help, but with coded situational assessments that her former subordinates would recognize as activation signals. Martha had chosen Redemption Creek with characteristic strategic consideration. The town's modest size and relative isolation made it unlikely anyone would recognize her from wanted posters long since removed from circulation. Its positioning at territorial crossroads provided sufficient commercial traffic to explain a general store's viable operation while allowing her to monitor regional developments through casual interaction with travelers. Most importantly, the community possessed a certain intrinsic resilience. Independent-minded residents with frontier self-sufficiency who maintained mutual support without excessive dependence on external authority. Martha recognized these qualities from communities that had successfully resisted similar corporate takeovers elsewhere, though the residents themselves remained unaware of their potential strength. For 15 years, Martha Blackwell had been nothing more than she appeared, an aging widow running a modest general store, her remarkable past buried beneath layers of carefully constructed identity. The elderly persona began as partial performance, but gradually incorporated genuine, physical changes as she entered her 70s. The strategic mind remained razor-sharp, but she had accepted that her days of active criminal enterprise were permanently behind her. Until Frank Durant and his associates targeted Redemption Creek for their railroad development scheme, unknowingly, challenging the most formidable strategic mind in Western criminal history. Dawn found Martha at her store counter, presenting the same composed, elderly shopkeeper's demeanor she had maintained for 15 years. Nothing in her appearance or behavior suggested she had spent the previous night conducting covert intelligence gathering through town darkness. The carefully maintained Martha Blackwell persona remained intact. Stooped shoulders, slightly trembling hands, and the measured movements of someone conserving limited energy. The store's morning routine proceeded normally. Merchandise straightened, deliveries accepted, customers served with the unhurried attention characteristic of rural commerce. Martha's interaction with townspeople revealed nothing of her heightened alert status or the contingency planning occupying her thoughts between transactions. Only the most observant might have noticed subtle differences in her information gathering. Her seemingly casual questions about Durant's activities carried more specific direction than previous conversations. Her positioning behind the counter afforded optimal observation of street activities while maintaining appearances of normal business operation. Mid-morning brought Deputy Morris back to the store, his expression suggesting a new purpose beneath lingering uncertainty. Martha assessed him with professional calculation, disguised as grandmotherly concern, noting improved weapon positioning and more alert posture than his previous visit. "Deputy," she greeted him warmly. "Lovely to see you again so soon." Morris removed his hat, his gesture more decisive than before. "Mrs. Blackwell, thought I'd check in, see how you're faring after Durant's visit yesterday." Martha poured coffee without being asked, the domestic gesture maintaining her established persona while facilitating extended conversation. "Such a persistent man," she commented, her tone suggesting elderly disapproval rather than strategic assessment. "Made quite a generous offer for my store, though I can't imagine why he'd value it so highly." The calculated revelation produced its intended effect. Morris leaned forward, interest sharpening his expression. "He's trying to buy you out?" He's approached several businesses with similar offers. Those who refuse find themselves facing escalating problems. "And so I've gathered," Martha nodded, handing him the coffee cup. "Quite a sophisticated operation for common bandits, wouldn't you say?" The phrasing was deliberate, testing Morris's perception while introducing analytical framing that might reshape his understanding of their situation. The deputy's response would indicate whether he possessed the observational capabilities and conceptual flexibility Martha needed for potential alliance. Morris considered her statement, recognition dawning in his expression. "You don't think they're just criminals, do you?" "Criminal methods serving commercial objectives," Martha clarified, allowing more analytical precision than her typical elderly persona might display. The calculated risk exposed more of her cognitive capabilities than previously revealed to the deputy, but established a framework for potential operational cooperation. "The railroad meeting yesterday," Morris connected, lowering his voice despite the empty store. "Anderson said territorial commissioners were involved. If Durant's working for financial interests with political connections, then conventional law enforcement approaches become problematic," Martha finished, noting with approval how quickly Morris grasped implications. His potential value as an asset increased substantially with demonstrated analytical capabilities. The deputy sat down, his coffee cup, frustration evident in his expression. "What can we do? Sheriff still laid up, no response from territorial authorities, and Durant's men outnumber me 15-1. Martha recognized the critical recruitment moment, when a potential asset seeks direction and demonstrates openness to unconventional approaches. Her response would establish operational relationship parameters while maintaining necessary identity security. Direct confrontation would be unwise, she observed, her tone modulated to suggest concerned wisdom rather than tactical assessment. But perhaps more information about their operation would reveal pressure points beyond mere physical opposition. Morris studied her with new attention, clearly recognizing something beneath her elderly exterior that contradicted surface appearance. "You seem to understand these situations better than most shopkeepers, Mrs. Blackwell." The comment presented both opportunity and security risk. Martha calculated response options, selecting limited disclosure that would establish credibility while preserving essential cover integrity. "My first husband worked for Wells Fargo Investigation Department," she offered, seamlessly integrating this fabrication into her established background. "Specialized in corporate criminal enterprises similar to what we're facing. I absorbed more than most wives might during our marriage." The explanation provided plausible justification for specialized knowledge while reinforcing her non-threatening elderly widow persona. Morris accepted the explanation with visible relief, content to receive guidance without questioning its source too deeply. "What would your husband have suggested in this situation?" he asked, unconsciously repositioning himself as a student. Rather than an authority figure, Martha allowed herself a small, reminiscent smile that concealed the tactical assessment behind her response. "He always emphasized intelligence gathering before action. Understanding your opposition's true objectives, vulnerabilities, and timeline provides advantage beyond mere numerical superiority." As she spoke, Martha subtly established an operational framework that would integrate Morris into her developing countermeasures without revealing their true source or extent. The deputy would become an intelligence asset and potential implementation resource, while believing himself part of a collaborative resistance rather than directed operation. "I've been hearing fragments about their operation," Morris offered, clearly responding to her implied direction. The telegraph operator mentioned communications to Denver financial houses, something about property acquisition deadlines and regulatory approvals. Martha nodded with apparent elderly interest, while mentally incorporating this confirmation of intelligence she had gathered personally the previous night. Morris's access to community information streams could prove valuable, particularly as Durant's security measures increased in response to initial resistance. "Perhaps collecting such fragments might reveal a pattern," she suggested, "particularly information about their timeline and external dependencies. Corporate operations typically have scheduling vulnerabilities that independent criminals lack." The conversation established operational parameters without explicit direction, positioning Morris as intelligence gatherer, while Martha maintained her non-threatening elderly persona. When the deputy departed, he carried implied tasking disguised as collaborative problem-solving, his demeanor suggesting renewed purpose without recognizing the subtle manipulation that had redirected his efforts toward Martha's developing strategy. The remainder of the morning brought additional intelligence through regular customer interactions. Durant's men had increased their presence in key locations overnight, suggesting operational acceleration consistent with information Martha had gathered during her covert activities. Several businesses reported escalating pressure to accept purchase offers, with physical intimidation transitioning from implied to explicit in cases of continued resistance. Martha processed this information with outward concern and inner analytical precision, updating her assessment of Durant's timeline and methods. The operation was advancing more rapidly than initially calculated, potentially in response to external pressure from financial interests impatient for property acquisition benchmarks referenced in the overheard meeting. Mid-afternoon brought unexpected development when the stagecoach arrived, carrying a passenger whose appearance caused immediate reaction throughout Redemption Creek. Even from her store window, Martha recognized the significance of the tall, distinguished man who descended from the coach with the practiced confidence of authority. Judge William Hargrove's reputation preceded him across 3 territories, an incorruptible federal circuit judge whose appearance typically signaled serious investigation into regional malfeasance. His arrival in Redemption Creek without prior announcement suggested a response to communications that had somehow circumvented Durant's control of telegraph operations. Martha observed with professional interest as Durant's men reacted to Hargrove's arrival, their patrol patterns disrupted by clearly unplanned contingency. The judge proceeded directly to Sheriff Wilson's office, his purposeful stride communicating official authority that created visible uncertainty among Durant's surveillance positions. The development required immediate assessment. Martha closed her store temporarily, displaying a "back in 30 minutes" sign, while she circulated through town on apparently innocent errands that allowed observation of the unfolding situation. Her elderly persona provided perfect cover for lingering in strategic locations, gathering intelligence through seemingly casual observation. Judge Hargrove's presence created immediate disruption to Durant's operation. The gang leader himself emerged from the Golden Nugget to intercept the judge before he could reach the injured sheriff, their conversation carrying the unmistakable tension of opposing authorities testing respective boundaries. Martha positioned herself within hearing range, her elderly appearance rendering her effectively invisible to men concerned with power dynamics rather than peripheral observers. "Unexpected pleasure, Your Honor," Durant greeted the judge with forced cordiality. "What brings the federal judiciary to our humble community?" Hargrove's response carried practiced precision, each word deliberately measured. Concerning reports about irregular business practices affecting interstate commerce interests, several communications suggested investigation might be warranted. The exchange confirmed Martha's developing assessment. Despite Durant's control of official telegraph communications, someone had successfully contacted federal authorities through alternative channels. The judge's reference to interstate commerce interests suggested jurisdiction beyond territorial officials, potentially compromised by the commercial conspiracy Martha had identified. As the development created both opportunity and complication, federal investigation could disrupt Durant's operation through legitimate authority channels, potentially removing necessity for Martha's more direct countermeasures. However, the judge's presence also increased scrutiny throughout Redemption Creek, creating additional security concerns for any covert operations she might implement. Martha maintained her observational position, noting Durant's physical responses that betrayed greater concern than his words expressed. The gang leader clearly recognized a significant threat to his operations timeline, though his outward demeanor projected confident dismissal. "Happy to address any concerns, Judge," Durant responded, his hand gesture summoning reinforcements from nearby positions. "Though I assure you, our business activities maintain strictest legal compliance. Perhaps my attorney can provide documentation at your convenience." The rapid deployment of armed men created implicit physical threat, despite Durant's courteous words. Martha noted the judge's recognition of the intimidation attempt, his posture stiffening slightly while maintaining professional composure. "I'll require access to Sheriff Wilson and complete review of all property transactions conducted within the last 30 days, Hargrove stated, his authoritative tone precluding the argument despite being physically outnumbered. The confrontation established an immediate challenge to Durant's control of Redemption Creek. Martha observed the strategic implications with professional assessment, recognizing both opportunity and potential acceleration of timeline that would necessitate adjustment to her developing countermeasures. When the judge proceeded to Sheriff Wilson's location, despite Durant's visible displeasure, Martha returned to her store with apparently unhurried elderly pace that disguised her tactical urgency. The situation had evolved beyond initial assessment parameters, requiring immediate contingency implementation rather than continued intelligence gathering. The afternoon brought steady customer traffic, each interaction providing additional information about community response to Judge Hargrove's arrival. Hope had rekindled among Redemption Creek's residents, their cautious optimism evident in conversations that speculated about potential federal intervention against Durant's operation. Martha maintained her benevolent shopkeeper persona while inwardly calculating that such optimism was dangerously premature. Durant's reaction to the judge's arrival suggested contingency planning for official interference rather than capitulation. The gang leader's consultation with expensively dressed individuals, Martha identified as legal representatives, indicated preparation for procedural resistance rather than immediate withdrawal. Her assessment proved accurate when Judge Hargrove himself visited her store late afternoon, his expression suggesting frustrated determination beneath professional courtesy. "Mrs. Blackwell," he greeted her with formal politeness. "Judge William Hargrove, Federal Circuit Court. I understand, Mr. Durant has expressed interest in acquiring your establishment." Martha presented perfect elderly respectfulness, her posture and expression calibrated to project vulnerability and transparency while revealing nothing of her analytical assessment of the judge's tactical position. "He's made quite a generous offer," she confirmed, retrieving Durant's document from beneath her counter, "though I'm reluctant to leave my home at my age." Hargrove examined the purchase offer, his experienced eye noting the same elements Martha had identified during her own analysis. "Interesting corporate structure," he observed. "Development subsidiaries nested within holding companies. Quite sophisticated for frontier property acquisition." The comment confirmed Martha's assessment of Hargrove's investigative capabilities. The judge had immediately recognized the complex legal architecture designed to obscure ultimate ownership and regulatory accountability. "Is there something improper about Mr. Durant's offer?" Martha inquired, her tone suggesting elderly concern rather than strategic information gathering. Hargrove considered his response with judicial caution. "Not necessarily improper in strict legal terms. However, patterns of accelerated acquisition, combined with reports of intimidation, suggest potential investigation under federal commerce statutes." As the careful phrasing revealed both opportunity and limitation, the judge recognized potential illegality but required additional evidence before implementing substantive intervention. His presence might temporarily disrupt Durant's operation, but wouldn't immediately remove the threat to Redemption Creek's independence. "Several business owners have reported concerning pressure tactics," Martha offered, providing information that might advance federal investigation while maintaining her non-threatening persona. "Mr. Miller at the hardware store suffered property damage after declining a similar offer." Hargrove nodded, making brief notation in a small journal extracted from his vest pocket. "I've heard similar accounts. Unfortunately, local witness testimony without corroborating evidence presents certain evidentiary challenges, particularly when opposing counsel can argue business disputes rather than systematic intimidation." The response confirmed Martha's assessment of procedural limitations facing legitimate authority. Even federal judicial power required evidential foundation that Durant's operation had carefully avoided generating through plausible deniability and jurisdictional complexity. "What will happen to our town, Judge?" Martha asked, the question serving dual purpose, maintaining her elderly persona's apparent vulnerability while extracting tactical intelligence about federal intervention timeline. Hargrove's expression revealed momentary frustration beneath his professional demeanor. "I've issued a temporary restraining order preventing property transfers pending investigation. Beyond that, procedural requirements may delay substantive action for several weeks while evidence is compiled and jurisdictional questions addressed." Information confirmed Martha's tactical assessment. Federal intervention would create temporary disruption, but not immediate resolution. Durant's operation would adjust rather than withdraw, potentially increasing pressure to complete property acquisition before full investigation materialized. After Hargrove departed, Martha allowed genuine concern to surface briefly beneath her carefully maintained persona. The judge's arrival had altered operational dynamics, but not fundamentally changed the threat to Redemption Creek. If anything, Durant would likely accelerate his timeline, potentially transitioning from intimidation to more direct action against holdout properties like her store. The afternoon confirmed this assessment as Durant's men established a more visible presence throughout town, their patrol pattern suggesting heightened alert status rather than operational withdrawal. Through her store window, Martha observed their increased weapons, readiness and communication frequency, indicating contingency implementation rather than defensive repositioning. Evening brought the day's most significant development when Judge Hargrove departed unexpectedly on the outbound stagecoach, his expression suggesting frustrated determination rather than complete intervention. Martha observed his departure from strategic vantage point, noting Durant's men maintaining surveillance without direct interference, suggesting legal rather than physical countermeasures had achieved temporary removal of federal oversight. The development necessitated immediate tactical reassessment. Martha closed her store at normal time, maintaining established patterns while inwardly accelerating contingency planning. Durant had neutralized federal intervention through legal maneuvering rather than direct confrontation, demonstrating sophisticated corporate resources beyond typical criminal operation. After securing her store, Martha descended to her basement sanctuary, reviewing intelligence gathered throughout the day with the methodical precision that had once made the Black Rose legendary among criminal strategists. Judge Hargrove's temporary intervention and subsequent departure had revealed critical information about Durant's operation, particularly its political protection and legal resources that could counter even federal judiciary through procedural mechanisms. The situation required more direct countermeasures than initially planned. Martha opened a concealed compartment containing specialized equipment maintained for contingencies she had never expected to employ. The tools of her former profession remained in perfect condition despite decades of disuse, testament to the meticulous preparation that had defined her operational methodology throughout her criminal career. As she examined these artifacts from another lifetime, Martha allowed herself a rare moment of genuine reflection. 30 years had passed since she had employed these methods against corporate interests, using criminal intimidation to achieve commercial objectives. The irony wasn't lost on her that she now prepared to use similar approaches to counter operations, resembling those she had once perfected. The Black Rose had disappeared from wanted posters and frontier legends, but the strategic brilliance that had made Martha Madison the most successful criminal mastermind in territorial history remained undiminished. Durant and his corporate backers believed themselves facing nothing more than scattered community resistance, easily overcome through intimidation and procedural manipulation. They couldn't possibly imagine that their seemingly most vulnerable target, an elderly widow running a modest general store, was in reality the legendary tactician who had once orchestrated the most sophisticated criminal enterprise the Western Territories had ever known. As Martha prepared specialized equipment for the night's activities, her movements carried the practiced efficiency of someone returning to fundamental expertise after a long absence. The decades fell away, tactical assessment replacing elderly persona with focused preparation that would have been immediately recognizable to anyone who had encountered the Black Rose in her operational prime. Redemption Creek's resistance was about to receive clandestine guidance from the most unlikely source imaginable. A criminal legend whose strategic genius would be deployed against the very methods she had once pioneered. The bitter irony brought a rare smile to Martha's expression as she completed preparations for implementing countermeasures. Durant's operation wouldn't anticipate from the seemingly helpless elderly shopkeeper. The black rose was about to bloom, once more, though in service of justice rather than criminal enterprise. The transformation brought peculiar satisfaction Martha hadn't anticipated. Redemption of sorts for the young woman whose brilliant mind had found no legitimate outlet in a society that underestimated female capability, now employed to protect. A community that had provided peaceful retirement she had never expected to cherish. Darkness enveloped Redemption Creek, broken only by scattered lamplight from the saloon and the occasional patrol lantern carried by Durant's men. Inside her store, Martha worked with quiet efficiency, preparing for what she sensed would be an inevitable confrontation. Judge Hargrove's abrupt departure had confirmed her suspicions about Durant's political protection and likely accelerated his timeline. From a hidden compartment behind a seemingly ordinary bookshelf, Martha retrieved specialized equipment maintained for contingencies she had never expected to employ. Small signal mirrors with distinctive reflection patterns, marking chalk that remained invisible except under specific light conditions. Most significant was a modified telegraph key concealed within an ordinary sewing box, her own innovation from decades earlier for covert communications when standard lines were under surveillance. Martha had installed connection points for this system throughout Redemption Creek during her 15 years of residence, implementing them gradually through seemingly innocent maintenance work. The network had been created as pure contingency, a lifelong habit of preparation. Now it would serve an urgent necessity. Descending to her reinforced basement, Martha activated the communication system for the first time. Her first transmission targeted Finnegan's barber shop, where Henry Finnegan's appreciation for gossip masked remarkable observational capabilities. Similar signals activated connections at Sullivan's medical practice, Harper's Hotel, and the Jenkins livery stable. Each location selected for both positioning and the occupants demonstrated reliability. Within 30 minutes, Martha had established a rudimentary communication network without any participants knowing others' involvement or the system's true origin. Each node received basic instructions for observing Durant's operations without revealing interest. Observation assignments were tailored to each location's natural advantages: Finnegan's position near the saloon, Sullivan's medical practice for intelligence about the injured sheriff, Harper's Hotel for information about outside contacts. With this intelligence network activated, Martha turned to more direct preparations. The store's interior underwent subtle transformation as she repositioned merchandise to create defensive positions and clear fields of fire. Heavy flour barrels created bulletproof barricades disguised as inventory management. Glass containers were removed from potential ricochet paths and replaced with tin goods to minimize fragmentation. Most significantly, Martha retrieved specialized firearms from concealment locations throughout the building. Not the ornate custom weapons that had been the Black Rose's signature, but reliable, easily concealed pieces positioned for access from multiple locations within the store. A soft tapping at her back door interrupted these preparations. Martha instantly transitioned to her elderly persona, stooping her shoulders and adjusting her spectacles before responding. The signal pattern identified the visitor as Deputy Morris. "Deputy," she greeted him through the slightly open door. "Rather late for social calls." Morris glanced nervously over his shoulder. "I need to speak with you privately, Mrs. Blackwell. Something's happening with Durant's operation." Martha admitted him with convincing elderly caution, noting his heightened alertness and the additional ammunition visible in his gun belt. "Judge Hargrove's departure has changed things," Morris reported once safely inside, his voice lowered. "Durant's men are implementing something they're calling Phase 2 tonight. Overheard them organizing teams for specific properties, including your store." "When?" Martha asked, the question's directness slightly inconsistent with her elderly persona but necessary given the urgency. "Midnight," Morris replied, checking his pocket watch. "Less than 3 hours from now. They're gathering at the saloon, distributing assignments. At least 4 men designated for your location." Martha processed this intelligence with rapid tactical assessment. Direct confrontation with multiple opponents would compromise her carefully maintained identity. Alternative approach was necessary. "I appreciate the warning, Deputy. Perhaps I should seek shelter elsewhere tonight?" Morris shook his head, frustration evident. "They've got men watching all the roads out of town, and they've stationed observers at most residences where you might seek refuge. They're isolating targets before moving. Perhaps you could stay here tonight, Deputy," she suggested, her tone conveying elderly vulnerability while actually implementing the first phase of her counter-strategy. "Your official presence might discourage these unpleasant men." Morris straightened, clearly responding to the apparent opportunity for heroic intervention. "Of course, Mrs. Blackwell. My duty is protecting citizens from exactly this kind of intimidation." While preparing coffee in the back room, Martha implemented accelerated preparations, activating pre-positioned countermeasures throughout the store with efficiency that would have revealed her true capabilities to a knowledgeable observer. Fortunately, the deputy remained focused on securing front windows. "I've been thinking about what your first husband might suggest in this situation," Morris commented when she returned. "The Wells Fargo investigator you mentioned. Would he have recommended direct confrontation or some alternative approach?" "He always emphasized psychological advantage over physical confrontation," Martha offered, the guidance drawn directly from her own operational methodology. "Creating uncertainty in opponents' minds about the tactical situation they're entering." Morris considered this, his expression suggesting limited comprehension without specific examples. "For instance," she continued, "he might suggest allowing intruders to believe they've achieved surprise, only to discover the situation isn't what they anticipated. Create the impression of vulnerability, then reveal strength from unexpected direction," Morris summarized, unconsciously articulating the fundamental strategy that had defined Martha's criminal career. "Precisely," she confirmed, satisfaction concealed beneath elderly supportiveness. At precisely 11:30, Martha detected movement patterns indicating Durant's operation had begun. Shadows shifted along the street approaching her store, their disciplined movement confirming Morris's intelligence. "They're coming," she informed him quietly, "earlier than expected." "How can you tell?" Morris asked, hand moving instinctively toward his weapon. Martha pointed toward shadows, barely visible from their position. "Movement by the Hendersons' fence line. My aging eyes might be failing, but they've always been sensitive to unusual patterns." The deputy nodded, verifying her observation. "At least 3 men approached from the east side, using property boundaries for cover. Definitely not routine patrol patterns." "What should we do, Deputy?" Martha asked, maintaining her dependent persona, while allowing Morris to assume the psychological authority position that would facilitate his function within her actual tactical framework. "Stay back from windows," he instructed, checking his weapon. "Position yourself behind the counter where there's better protection. I'll handle any uninvited visitors." Martha complied with convincing elderly obedience, the movement actually placing her in precisely the position she had selected during earlier preparations. The confrontation began with calculated intimidation, rather than immediate violence. A single rock shattered the front window, the deliberate property damage serving as psychological preparation before human threat appeared. "Mrs. Blackwell," a voice called from the darkness. "Final opportunity to accept Mr. Durant's generous purchase offer. Documentation ready for your signature with reasonable compensation for your cooperation." Martha recognized Cummings' voice, Durant's lieutenant serving as a negotiation point before escalation. "Deputy Morris here," the young lawman responded. "This property is under official protection. Any unauthorized entry constitutes criminal trespass, subject to legitimate defensive response." Laughter from multiple positions outside confirmed Martha's concern about the deputy's premature declaration. "Didn't expect to find you playing the hero, Morris," Cummings called back. "One lawman against 6 experienced professionals presents poor odds for career longevity." Morris visibly tensed, recognition of numerical disadvantage undermining his confidence. Martha recognized the critical intervention moment. "My father always said odds don't determine outcomes nearly so much as preparation and positioning," she offered quietly. "Even superior numbers can be neutralized by environmental advantage and psychological uncertainty." "Cummings," Morris called out with renewed authority, "I've sent notification to territorial authorities regarding tonight's activities. Any action against this property will have documented witnesses and consequences beyond local jurisdiction." Brief silence suggested the statement had achieved temporary disruption to Durant's operation. "The final opportunity, Mrs. Blackwell," Cummings called again, voice hardened. "Your elderly welfare concerns Mr. Durant deeply. Would be unfortunate if excitement proved detrimental to your fragile health. Deputy Morris cannot ensure your safety against determined business representatives." "I'm just a frightened old woman," she called back, her voice perfectly calibrated to project elderly terror while implementing her counter-strategy. "Please don't hurt me. I'll sign whatever you want." "Sensible decision," Cummings responded, satisfaction evident. "We'll come inside with documentation. Deputy Morris will maintain his weapon in a holstered position to ensure a comfortable business environment." Martha could practically feel the deputy's confusion at her apparent surrender. As footsteps approached the front door, she positioned herself with seemingly frightened elderly movements that actually established optimal placement for the confrontation's next phase. "Stay calm," she whispered to Morris, the instruction disguised as frightened reassurance. "Remember what I said about things not being what they appear." The door opened, admitting Cummings and 2 additional men with confident postures. "Documentation." "Here, Mrs. Blackwell," Cummings announced, producing official-looking papers. "Simple signature transfers ownership with generous compensation." Martha allowed her hands to tremble visibly as she reached for the offered papers. "I can't see without my reading glasses," she apologized, voice wavering as she fumbled in her apron pocket. "Old eyes aren't what they used to be." When her hand emerged, it held not reading glasses, but a small cloth pouch that dropped to the floor with deliberate clumsiness. The pouch burst on impact, releasing specially prepared powder that filled the immediate area with billowing dust. Simultaneously, Martha activated other prepared elements throughout the store. A concealed cord pulled by her foot released weighted fabrics from ceiling positions, further disorienting Durant's men. Previously positioned containers toppled with apparent randomness, creating audio confusion that masked precise movements behind the counter. "Fire!" she screamed with convincing elderly terror, the declaration serving both as signal to Morris and tactical misdirection. "The lamp's fallen! Fire!" The controlled chaos unfolded exactly as Martha had calculated. Deputy Morris, forewarned by Martha's earlier guidance, utilized the distraction to establish tactical advantage against disoriented opponents. Pre-positioned barricades dropped into place, transforming the store's open space into a channelized environment that separated Durant's men and disrupted their coordination. Previously concealed lighting created visibility imbalance, areas where Morris maintained clear sightlines, while opposition personnel experienced temporary blindness. "Drop your weapons," Morris commanded, newfound confidence evident as he recognized the tactical advantage Martha's preparations had created. "You're surrounded and disoriented. No one needs to get hurt if you surrender now." From behind the counter, Martha completed her performance with perfect theatrical timing. As Durant's men hesitated between resistance and surrender, a previously positioned display case toppled with thunderous impact, creating a final distraction that allowed Morris to secure his position. "I believe the deputy gave instructions," Martha called out, her voice suddenly devoid of elderly wavering, as she revealed a small derringer previously concealed in her apron pocket. The confrontation resolved without bloodshed, exactly as Martha had calculated. Cummings and his companions, disoriented by environmental manipulation and facing unexpected resistance, surrendered rather than escalating to violence. As Morris secured the prisoners, Martha allowed her performance to transition back toward elderly persona, though with subtle adjustments that acknowledged the impossibility of maintaining complete pretense after the tactical implementation she had orchestrated. "My goodness," she declared, the tremor returning to her voice, though moderated. "I never imagined my poor housekeeping would prove so fortunate, all those things falling at once." The explanation provided plausible cover for the orchestrated chaos, allowing Morris to perceive elderly luck rather than tactical brilliance behind their successful defense. "The Mrs. Blackwell," he acknowledged with newfound respect once the prisoners were properly restrained. "I believe I underestimated you." Martha adjusted her spectacles with seemingly elderly modesty. "Just fortunate accidents, Deputy. Though my first husband always said luck favors the prepared." Through her network's previously established communication system, Martha transmitted a simple signal indicating successful resistance. Throughout town, prepared responders implemented coordinated measures against suddenly uncertain opposition, leveraging the psychological advantage created by unexpected defense success. As dawn approached, Martha watched transformation spread through Redemption Creek. What had begun as isolated resistance at a supposedly vulnerable Widow's General Store had catalyzed community-wide response against Durant's operation. What Durant and his associates couldn't possibly recognize was that their midnight intimidation attempt had targeted not a vulnerable elderly widow, but the legendary tactician whose strategic brilliance had once orchestrated the most successful criminal enterprise in territorial history. The Black Rose hadn't just defended her store. She had implemented the first phase of a comprehensive counter-strategy against corporate criminals, employing methods she herself had helped pioneer decades earlier. Martha straightened merchandise with seemingly elderly fussiness, her expression revealing nothing of the tactical assessment occurring behind her spectacles. The confrontation's initial phase had concluded successfully, but the true challenge remained ahead. Durant would respond with resource escalation now that initial resistance parameters had been established. The Black Rose prepared accordingly, her strategic mind already calculating next phase implementation, while Martha Blackwell served coffee to grateful townspeople, gathering to share nervous excitement about the night's unexpected triumph. 1 year had passed since Durant's operation collapsed in Redemption Creek. The morning sun cast long shadows across the town's main street as Martha Blackwell stood in her doorway, watching the community go about its daily business with a quiet contentment she had never expected to experience in her lifetime. The general store continued to serve as the heart of Redemption Creek's commerce, though subtle changes in its operation reflected Martha's evolved relationship with the community. The reinforced shutters remained, no longer disguised as mere decoration. The strategic positioning of merchandise still offered clear sightlines and defensive advantages, now openly acknowledged as practical security measures rather than hidden preparations. Most significantly, the modest backroom where Martha had once maintained her solitary command center had been transformed into a community planning space where Sheriff Wilson, fully recovered from his wound, met regularly with a citizens' committee responsible for town security and development planning. "Morning, Mrs. Blackwell," called Timothy Fletcher, now a deputy under Wilson's expanded department. The young man had emerged as one of several promising recruits who had distinguished themselves during the confrontation with Durant's operation. "Committee meeting still set for this afternoon." Martha nodded, allowing her genuine smile to replace the carefully controlled expressions she had maintained for decades. 2 o'clock sharp. Sheriff's bringing those survey maps from the territorial office. Her voice carried the natural rasp of advancing age, but the artificial tremor had vanished months ago. At 73, Martha moved with the natural limitations of her years, rather than the exaggerated frailty she had once employed as disguise. The stooped shoulders had straightened somewhat, though arthritis, real rather than simulated, still affected her movements on cold mornings. As Timothy continued his rounds, Martha reflected on the remarkable transformation that had unfolded since that pivotal night when Durant's men had attempted to seize her store. What began as isolated resistance had catalyzed a community-wide response that ultimately dismantled not just Durant's local operation, but the entire corporate conspiracy behind it. The turning point had come 3 days after the initial confrontation, when the first responses to Martha's dispatched messages began arriving in Redemption Creek, not the dramatic cavalry charge of dime novels, but the quiet, methodical appearance of individuals whose unremarkable exteriors concealed exceptional capabilities. Former lieutenants of the Madison Raiders answering their leader's first call in 3 decades. David Harrison had arrived first, posing as a cattle buyer while bringing essential intelligence about Durant's corporate connections. Eliza Montgomery followed, her position as traveling dressmaker providing perfect cover for coordinating communications between resistance elements throughout town. By week's end, 6 former Madison Raiders had integrated themselves into Redemption Creek's daily life, each applying specialized skills towards systematic dismantling of Durant's operation. What Durant and his backers had failed to recognize was that their midnight intimidation attempt had targeted not just an elderly widow, but the legendary tactician whose strategic brilliance had orchestrated the most successful criminal enterprise in territorial history. The Black Rose hadn't simply defended her store. She had implemented a comprehensive counter-strategy against corporate criminals, employing methods she herself had pioneered decades earlier. "Thinking about old times?" asked a familiar voice, drawing Martha from her reflections. Samuel Donovan, once known as Shadow, for his ability to move undetected through supposedly secure locations, approached with the unhurried gait of a man with nowhere particular to be. His weathered face had aged considerably since their Madison Raiders days, though his eyes retained the sharp awareness that had once made him Martha's most effective intelligence gatherer. "Just appreciating the present," Martha replied, gesturing toward the bustling town center where the newly constructed territorial courthouse now stood, where Durant's saloon headquarters had once dominated the street. "Still hard to believe sometimes." Donovan nodded, understanding the unspoken meaning behind her words. Of all her former associates, he alone had remained in Redemption Creek after the confrontation concluded, establishing himself as a respectable hardware merchant whose military experience during the Civil War explained his occasional strategic insights during town planning meetings. "Received word from Eliza yesterday," he mentioned casually as they stepped inside the store. "The Denver operation is completely dismantled, last of Durant's financial backers facing federal prosecution for fraud and conspiracy." The information brought satisfaction without surprise. Martha had calculated this outcome months earlier, when Judge Hargrove returned with federal marshals following Durant's operation collapse. The evidence she had meticulously gathered and provided through seemingly unconnected channels had ensured complete dismantling of the corporate conspiracy rather than mere removal of its visible enforcement arm. And Durant himself, she inquired, though she already knew the answer through her own sources. 20 years at Yuma Territorial Prison, Donovan confirmed, accepting the coffee she offered with familiar ease. Though rumor suggests he's providing extensive testimony against his former employers in exchange for potential sentence reduction. Martha nodded, unsurprised by Durant's self-preservation instincts. And our former associates? Disappeared. Back into their respective lives, Donovan replied. Eliza returned to her dressmaking business in Santa Fe. Harrison's cattle operation in Wyoming continues to thrive. The others similarly settled. None have encountered any official interest in their brief visit to Redemption Creek. This outcome represented Martha's most significant victory. Not just the defeat of Durant's operation, but the protection of her former associates' carefully constructed lives. The Madison Raiders' brief resurrection had remained secret. Their contributions to Redemption Creek's liberation, attributed to spontaneous community resistance rather than coordinated operation by former territorial outlaws. As the store bell chimed as Deputy Morris entered, his bearing transformed from the uncertain young lawman who had sought Martha's guidance a year earlier. The confrontation with Durant's operation had accelerated his professional development, revealing capabilities that earned him promotion to Sheriff Wilson's second-in-command, with responsibility for training new recruits. Mrs. Blackwell, he greeted her warmly. Mr. Donovan, Sheriff sent me to confirm you'll both attend the dedication ceremony for the new school building tomorrow. Wouldn't miss it, Martha assured him, noting with approval how Morris's observational awareness had developed. His gaze now automatically assessed sightlines and positioning upon entering any space, a habit she recognized from her own operational protocols. The children have prepared something special for you, Morris added with a smile. Something about the town's bravest widow who helped save Redemption Creek. Martha chuckled, the sound genuine rather than performed. Brave or foolish, depending on one's perspective. After Morris departed, Donovan's expression shifted toward the professional assessment that had once made him her most trusted lieutenant. They still don't know, do they? Not even Morris or Wilson, about who you really were. They know who I am now, Martha replied after thoughtful consideration. Perhaps that's what matters most. The philosophical response reflected genuine evolution in Martha's perspective. For decades, her identity had been defined by strategic performance, first as the Black Rose commanding the Madison Raiders, then as Martha Blackwell maintaining elaborate cover through simulated frailty. The confrontation with Durant had necessitated partial revelation of her capabilities, but not her historical identity. What emerged was something unexpected, neither completely the legendary outlaw leader nor the fabricated elderly widow, but a synthesis that incorporated elements of both while transcending their limitations. Martha Blackwell was no longer a performance, but a genuine identity, integrating the strategic brilliance that had defined the Black Rose with the community connection that Martha had developed during 15 years in Redemption Creek. The afternoon brought the scheduled committee meeting, where Martha participated openly in planning discussions about the town's continued development. The railroad connection that Durant had intended to exploit for property speculation was proceeding through legitimate channels, with community oversight ensuring benefits would be equitably distributed rather than concentrated among outside investors. During these meetings, Martha employed the same strategic thinking that had once orchestrated territorial-scale criminal operations, now applied toward community prosperity and security. Sheriff Wilson and other town leaders had come to value her insights, attributed to accumulated wisdom rather than criminal expertise. None suspected that their elderly advisor had once been the most wanted woman in 3 territories. The eastern property development needs additional water access, Martha noted, indicating specific locations on the survey map spread across her backroom table. Otherwise, we'll create vulnerability during dry seasons when creek levels drop. The suggestion reflected the same logistical foresight that had once ensured Madison Raiders operations maintained multiple resource access points and contingency routes. The application differed, but the underlying strategic principles remained consistent: anticipate vulnerabilities, establish redundancies, create sustainable systems resistant to disruption. As committee members discussed implementation approaches, Martha observed their interactions with professional assessment that had become second nature through decades of leadership experience. Wilson had developed into an effective community coordinator since recovering from Durant's attack. Morris showed promising tactical adaptability that would serve him well as eventual successor. Harper from the hotel demonstrated unexpected talent for resource allocation that Martha had specifically encouraged through targeted mentorship. The Mrs. Blackwell's suggestion aligns with territorial development guidelines, Judge Hargrove noted, his regular visits to Redemption Creek having evolved from initial investigation to ongoing judicial oversight of the region's growth. Particularly considering recent drought patterns affecting similar communities eastward, the judge's support carried special significance for Martha. Of all Redemption Creek's officials, Hargrove had demonstrated the most sophisticated analytical capabilities. During the confrontation with Durant, she occasionally wondered whether his exceptionally thorough background investigations might have uncovered connections between Martha Blackwell and certain historical events, though he had never given any indication of such discovery. Their professional relationship maintained careful boundaries, mutual respect without unnecessary personal disclosure. Martha provided community insights and occasional strategic suggestions. Hargrove ensured territorial authorities remained responsive to local needs while maintaining appropriate legal frameworks. The arrangement served both individual and community interests without requiring complete transparency about Martha's remarkably complex past. As evening approached and committee members departed, Hargrove remained briefly behind, his expression suggesting professional consideration rather than casual conversation. Interesting development from territorial archives, he mentioned, his tone carefully neutral. Historical researchers examining outlaw activities during the 70s discovered several Madison Raiders operation records previously misclassified in military documents. Martha maintained composed interest appropriate to casual historical curiosity rather than personal concern. Fascinating how these historical fragments continue emerging after so many years. Indeed, Hargrove agreed, studying her with measured assessment. Most interesting was analytical evidence suggesting the infamous Black Rose had military strategic training, possibly acquired through family connection rather than formal education. The observation came dangerously close to personal biography, rather than general historical comment. Martha recognized potential probe rather than coincidental conversation, though Hargrove's expression remained professionally neutral rather than accusatory. History often reveals surprising capabilities in unexpected individuals, she responded, neither confirming nor contesting the implied connection. Particularly during frontier development, when conventional limitations sometimes proved less restrictive than in established society, Hargrove nodded, accepting her philosophical deflection rather than pursuing more direct inquiry. The researcher concluded that regardless of historical accuracy, the Black Rose represented significant evolutionary development in criminal methodology subsequently adopted by legitimate business operations, not always ethically. Perhaps methods themselves aren't inherently moral or immoral, Martha suggested, allowing more genuine perspective than normally revealed in such conversations. Rather, their application toward particular objectives determines their ethical character. The philosophical exchange represented deliberate professional courtesy, Hargrove indicating potential historical connections he may have identified without demanding explicit confirmation. Martha acknowledging the intellectual observation without unnecessary personal disclosure. Their mutual respect maintained a productive relationship without requiring complete transparency about Martha's remarkable past. After Hargrove departed, Martha remained in the back room, reviewing community development plans with the same meticulous attention she had once applied to outlaw operations. The parallels weren't lost on her. Strategic resource allocation, personnel development, contingency planning for potential disruptions. The methodologies remained consistent, even as objectives evolved from personal profit to community prosperity. As darkness settled over Redemption Creek, Martha completed her evening routine with practiced efficiency, securing the store while maintaining awareness of surrounding activities. The habits of operational security remained, despite decreased threat levels, though implemented now as practical precaution rather than fearful defense. As from her window, she observed evening activities unfolding across the transformed community. The courthouse lamp burned late as territorial officials processed documents for upcoming development projects. The newly established school remained illuminated while teachers prepared for the next day's dedication ceremony. Residents moved confidently through streets once dominated by Durant's patrols, their casual interactions reflecting fundamental security rather than anxious resignation. Samuel Donovan appeared at her door as scheduled, their evening ritual of chess and conversation having evolved into a comfortable routine over the past year. Unlike other Madison raiders who had departed after Durant's operation collapsed, Donovan had recognized something in Redemption Creek that resonated with his own complex journey from outlaw to legitimate businessman. Interesting conversation. With the judge, he inquired as they settled at the chessboard, his observation confirming Martha's assessment of potential surveillance during her interaction with Hargrove. Professional courtesy rather than direct inquiry, she replied, making the opening move with characteristic precision. Historical rather than personal interest, at least officially. Donovan nodded, understanding the implicit communication beneath her words. Sometimes allowing partial discovery creates comfortable equilibrium. Complete concealment requires constant vigilance that becomes increasingly exhausting. The observation reflected shared experience. Both had maintained complex identity, transformations over decades, balancing necessary security against the psychological burden of perpetual performance. Martha's partial revelation of capabilities during the confrontation with Durant had created unexpected liberation despite increased scrutiny. "I've been considering something," Martha mentioned as their game progressed with familiar strategic complexity. The historical records Hargrove referenced, properly contextualized, they might provide valuable lessons for legitimate security operations. Perhaps anonymous contribution to territorial archives might serve community interests while ensuring historical accuracy. Donovan considered the suggestion with professional assessment that had once made him a valuable strategic advisor during Madison Raiders operations. Selective disclosure through appropriate channels, controlling the narrative rather than allowing fragmented discovery and potentially inaccurate reconstruction. "Precisely," Martha confirmed, advancing the bishop with a tactical purpose that paralleled her broader strategic thinking. Not personal confession or romantic rehabilitation, but practical contribution, ensuring valuable methodologies aren't lost while distinguishing between operational principles and specific historical applications. Their discussion continued through the evening, exploring potential approaches for what Martha increasingly regarded as appropriate legacy management. Not dramatic redemption narrative or historical revisionism, but practical contribution, ensuring the strategic innovations she had developed served constructive rather than exploitative purposes in territorial development. As their chess game concluded with characteristic strategic equilibrium, Donovan raised questions that reflected their shared journey from outlaws to community members. Do you ever regret the transition? The Madison Raiders represented unprecedented achievement in strategic organization. Your current influence, while significant, remains necessarily limited by contextual constraints. Martha considered the question with genuine reflection rather than automatic response. The Raiders were an extraordinary accomplishment in organizational design and strategic implementation, but their purpose remained fundamentally extractive rather than constructive, taking from existing systems rather than building sustainable alternatives. She gestured toward the window, where Redemption Creek's transformed community continued its evening activities. This represents a different challenge, creating systems that generate prosperity rather than merely redistributing existing resources. Perhaps less dramatic than territorial-scale heists, but potentially more meaningful as genuine legacy. Donovan nodded, understanding the philosophical evolution her response represented. What had begun as necessary cover identity had transformed into authentic connection with the community that provided unexpected fulfillment in her final years. The legendary Black Rose hadn't simply disappeared into historical obscurity, but evolved into something neither she nor her pursuers could have anticipated. As after Donovan departed, Martha completed final evening preparations with characteristic thoroughness, though now motivated by practical security rather than fearful hypervigilance. The basement command center she had once maintained had been largely repurposed for community storage, though certain specialized equipment remained secured for contingencies she considered increasingly unlikely but refused to dismiss entirely. From her bedroom window, Martha observed Redemption Creek beneath, moonlight that silvered the transformed community. Durant's operation had inadvertently catalyzed remarkable development by forcing previously isolated individuals to recognize their collective capabilities. The resistance Martha had strategically orchestrated had evolved beyond immediate security, concerns toward comprehensive community development. Most significantly, Martha herself had undergone an unexpected transformation. The performance of Martha Blackwell, initially created as an elaborate cover identity, had evolved into an authentic person, integrating elements of her complex history while transcending their limitations. Not mere shopkeepers pretending helplessness, nor legendary outlaws manipulating from shadows, but community elders contributing accumulated wisdom toward genuine prosperity. As she prepared for sleep, Martha allowed herself a rare moment of philosophical reflection on life's remarkable unpredictability. The brilliant young woman who had found no legitimate outlet for her strategic capabilities had become the notorious Black Rose, commanding the West's most feared outlaw gang. That legendary figure had transformed into elderly widow seeking anonymous retirement in a remote community. Now, in life's final chapter, she had emerged as something entirely unexpected, a respected elder whose strategic guidance served community prosperity rather than personal profit. The evolution brought satisfaction, deeper than any successful heist or tactical victory had provided during her outlaw years. Not dramatic redemption narrative as portrayed in sensationalist dime novels, but authentic integration of capabilities once employed for self-serving purposes, now directed toward genuine community benefit. Tomorrow's school dedication would celebrate Redemption Creek's transformation following Durant's defeat. Children would honor the town's bravest widow without recognizing the legendary outlaw whose strategic brilliance had orchestrated their community's liberation. The partial understanding represented perfect equilibrium, sufficient acknowledgement of Martha's contribution without unnecessary exposure of historical identity that would complicate both personal security and community relationships. As moonlight cast long shadows across Redemption Creek's transformed streets, Martha allowed herself a quiet smile at life's remarkable capacity for unexpected evolution. The Black Rose had disappeared from wanted posters into historical footnotes, while Martha Blackwell had emerged from fabricated cover identity into authentic community members whose strategic guidance helped shape territorial development toward equitable prosperity rather than exploitative extraction. Neither identity fully captured her complex reality, yet both contributed to a legacy more meaningful than she had anticipated during decades of tactical calculation rather than genuine connection. The notorious outlaw, who had once commanded the West's most feared gang, had found unexpected fulfillment as elderly widow, whose strategic guidance now served a community that had provided a belated but deeply appreciated sense of genuine belonging. Martha closed her window, securing it with habitual thoroughness born from a lifetime of operational security, now maintained as practical precaution rather than fearful necessity. Tomorrow would bring new opportunities for contributing strategic insights toward community development, continuing evolution that had transformed legendary outlaws into respected elders without requiring dramatic confession or romantic redemption. Narrative. The transformation represented not simplistic moral reversal, but authentic integration of remarkable capabilities once employed for self-serving purposes, now directed toward genuine community benefit. Not divine redemption or historical revisionism, but human capacity for meaningful evolution when circumstances provide unexpected opportunity for applying exceptional capabilities toward constructive rather than extractive purposes. As Martha Blackwell, once the notorious Black Rose, prepared for sleep in a community she had unexpectedly come to value beyond tactical consideration, she reflected that perhaps this represented the most successful operation of her remarkable career. Not territory-wide heists that had become legendary among frontier stories, but transformation of fabricated identity into authentic person contributing genuine value to a community that had provided an unexpected but deeply appreciated sense of belonging in life's final chapter. The West's most feared outlaw had disappeared not through dramatic last stand or clever escape, but through remarkable evolution into someone both more ordinary and more extraordinary than the legendary Black Rose had ever been. Community elder whose strategic guidance served genuine prosperity rather than personal profit or territorial notoriety. Martha settled into sleep with uncharacteristic contentment, secure in knowledge that tomorrow would bring new opportunities for applying her remarkable capabilities toward community benefit rather than personal advantage. The transformation represented no conclusion to remarkable life, but an unexpected final chapter, more meaningful than she could have anticipated during decades of tactical calculation without genuine connection. The notorious Black Rose had disappeared from wanted posters, while Martha Blackwell had emerged from fabricated identity into an authentic community member. The evolution represented not simplistic redemption, but human capacity for meaningful transformation when circumstances provide unexpected opportunity for directing exceptional capabilities toward constructive rather than exploitative purposes. Legacy more significant than territorial notoriety and more personally fulfilling than accumulated wealth from legendary heists. Tomorrow's school dedication would celebrate community transformation following Durant's defeat, honoring the town's bravest widow without recognizing legendary outlaws whose strategic brilliance had orchestrated their liberation. The partial understanding represented perfect equilibrium, sufficient acknowledgement without unnecessary complications. Martha Blackwell, once the notorious Black Rose, settled into sleep with uncharacteristic contentment, secure in knowledge that her final chapter had provided an unexpected but deeply appreciated opportunity for meaningful contribution rather than mere tactical victory. The West's most feared outlaw had found her greatest triumph not in spectacular heist or daring escape, but in remarkable evolution from legendary criminal to authentic community member whose strategic guidance now served genuine prosperity rather than personal profit or territorial notoriety. Not simplistic moral reversal, but authentic integration of exceptional capabilities toward constructive rather than extractive purposes. Legacy more meaningful than frontier legends and more personally fulfilling than the notorious reputation that had once defined her remarkable life. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.